There is a place in the middle of America that most people drive through without ever really seeing. A region of low, rounded mountains and deep hollows, of cedar glades and limestone bluffs, of rivers so clear you can count the pebbles on the bottom from 10 feet up. People call it the Ozarks, and they imagine they know what it is. Hillbilly country, folk music country, fishing and floating and firefly summers. A place that history, real history, the kind that changes how you think about everything, more or less bypassed on its way somewhere more important. That is exactly what someone wanted you to believe. Because hidden in those hills, tucked inside those hollows, buried under centuries of cedar duff and wild grape and the slow, patient work of time, there are stones. Not ordinary stones, not the limestone boulders that rivers have always tumbled into casual piles. These are stones that were moved, stones that were shaped, stones that were raised into positions they could not have reached without intention, without planning, without hands that understood something we have spent the last 2 centuries pretending those hands could never have understood. This is a story about those stones, and about the people who may have placed them, and about why, in a country that has built entire industries around the mythology of its own past, these particular mysteries have been allowed to gather dust in the archives of local historical societies and the fading notebooks of amateur researchers who spent their weekends scrambling up bluffs that nobody else thought worth climbing. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Let's start with something simple. Something you can hold in your mind, the way you might hold a smooth river stone in your palm, feeling the weight of it, the cool solidity of it, before you begin to understand what you are actually holding. The Ozark Plateau is old. Not old in the way that we usually mean when we say a place is old. Not colonial old or even indigenous settlement old in the way most Americans think about indigenous settlement, which is to say, not very old at all in most people's imaginations. The Ozarks are old in the geological sense, which means that the rock you are standing on when you stand in the Boston Mountains of Arkansas or on the current river bluffs of Missouri was already ancient before the first fish crawled out of the sea. The plateau itself, this uplifted dome of dolomite and chert and limestone, has been above water for something like 300 million years. The rivers that cut through it, the White and the Black and the Current and the Gasconade and the 11 Point and a dozen others, have been carving their valleys for millions of years. The caves that honeycomb the bedrock, some of them among the longest in North America, have been forming in the dark for as long as there has been water moving through limestone. By the time the first human beings arrived in this landscape, it was already a world of extraordinary complexity, a world of sinkholes and springs and disappearing streams, of bluffs that rose 100 feet above the river and then vanished into cedar thickets, of glades where the thin soil over the bedrock allowed only the most specialized plants to survive, plants that had adapted over thousands of generations to this precise combination of heat and drought and exposure. A world that rewarded those who understood it and punished those who did not. The first people understood it. We know this because they left traces, not the kind of traces we usually look for when we are looking for evidence of ancient human occupation, not pottery in stratified layers or projectile points sorted by style and period into clean typological sequences. They left those things too, and we have found them, and they are interesting in the way that all archaeological evidence is interesting, but they also left something else, something that does not fit neatly into the typological sequences. Something that sits outside the established narratives the way an uninvited guest sits outside a party, present and undeniable and deeply inconvenient. They left stones. Not just any stones. Stones arranged in configurations that no geological process can fully explain. Stones stacked in ways that suggest specific intentions. Stones aligned to celestial events with a precision that implies prolonged observation and careful planning. Stones placed in locations that seem to have been chosen for reasons that go beyond simple convenience, that seem, when you look at them long enough and hard enough, to have been chosen for reasons that might have to do with the sky, or with the water beneath the ground, or with something else entirely, something that we, in our particular moment in history, may not have the right vocabulary to name. These are the stones we are going to talk about tonight, and we are going to talk about them slowly, because they deserve that, because the people who placed them, whoever they were, whatever they understood, lived in a relationship with time that was nothing like our relationship with time. They thought in generations. They planned across lifetimes. The least we can do is spend a few quiet hours with them, The first thing you need to understand about the Ozarks is that the region has always been, in archaeological terms, something of a problem. Not a problem in the sense that there is no evidence of ancient occupation. There is enormous evidence of ancient occupation. The Ozarks have been inhabited by human beings for at least 14,000 years, possibly longer if you accept some of the more controversial early entry sites, and possibly much longer than that if you are willing to sit with the kind of uncertainty that most professional archaeologists find professionally uncomfortable. The problem is that the evidence does not always behave the way the established models say it should behave. The standard story of pre-Columbian North America, the one that is taught in schools and enshrined in textbooks and displayed in museum dioramas, is a story of gradual cultural development moving in predictable directions. Hunter-gatherers giving way to more settled peoples developing horticulture, horticulture leading to agriculture, agriculture leading to complexity, complexity leading to the kinds of societies that build large and durable things, earthworks and platform mounds and planned towns with organized trade networks, and something approaching what we would recognize as political hierarchy. This story is not wrong, exactly. The Mississippian culture that dominated much of the eastern half of North America between roughly 900 and 1300 Common Era built some of the most impressive monuments in ancient North America. Cahokia, the great urban complex near modern St. Louis, at its peak, housed a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people, and centered on a platform mound that covered more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Mississippians were builders. They moved earth on a scale that should make anyone who encounters their work stop and reconsider their assumptions about what was possible in pre-Columbian North America. But the Ozarks sat at the edge of Mississippian territory, and the standard story has always treated the plateau as something of a cultural backwater, too rugged for intensive agriculture, too difficult for the kinds of large-scale social organization that characterized the major Mississippian centers. A place where people lived, certainly, but lived simply, lived in small groups, lived without the kind of sustained collective effort that produces monuments. That is the standard story. And then there are the stones. To understand what makes these stones strange, you need to understand what ordinary stones in the Ozarks look like. The bedrock of the Ozarks is primarily dolomite and chert and limestone, all of which are sedimentary rocks that were laid down in shallow tropical seas hundreds of millions of years ago. Over time, as the plateau was uplifted and the rivers cut down through it, these rocks have been exposed at the surface in vast quantities. Walk almost anywhere in the Ozarks, and you will find rocks. Rocks in the fields, rocks in the creek beds, rocks piled along fence lines by generations of farmers clearing their land, rocks tumbled into casual heaps by the freeze-thaw cycles of winter, rocks split and shattered and rearranged by the slow violence of weathering. This abundance of surface rock is important, because it means that any claim that a particular arrangement of stones is artificial, that it was placed rather than formed naturally, has to be made carefully. You cannot simply point at a pile of rocks in the Ozarks and say that humans made it. You have to look more carefully than that. And when you look carefully, some of what you find is genuinely puzzling. There are walls. Not walls in the sense of the stone walls that European settlers built to clear their fields, which are unmistakably functional in their randomness, built of whatever stone was to hand, of whatever size and shape came up out of the ground. These are walls of a different kind. Walls built of flat stones laid in courses. Stones that have been selected for their flatness. Sometimes stones that have been shaped or trimmed to improve the fit. Walls that run for distances too long to be easily explained as the product of a single family clearing a single field. Walls that sometimes turn corners at precise angles. Walls that sometimes form enclosures, sometimes form apparent pathways, sometimes simply run to the edge of a bluff and stop, as if whoever built them walked off the edge and kept going. There are what appear to be worked stone surfaces, flat outcroppings of bedrock that have been ground or abraded into shapes that suggest deliberate modification, basins carved into rock that collect and hold rainwater, grooves that run in directions that seem too consistent to be accidental. Petroglyphs, in some cases, though the petroglyphs of the Ozarks are under-investigated compared to those of the American Southwest, and many of them remain in a kind of archaeological limbo, acknowledged but not fully studied, documented but not fully understood. And then there are the more dramatic features, the things that stop you in your tracks if you are paying attention, that make you stand very still in the middle of a cedar glade or on the edge of a bluff and ask yourself, out loud sometimes, What in the world you are looking at? Let me tell you about one of them. In the hills of southern Missouri, in a stretch of country that is technically public land but that receives almost no visitors because it is not on any marked trail and is not mentioned in any guidebook and is, frankly, not the kind of place that draws casual hikers, because the terrain is demanding and the ticks are abundant, and there is no particular reward waiting for you at the end of a clearly marked path, there is a ridge. On this ridge, someone arranged a series of standing stones. Not standing in the sense of a Stonehenge pillar, not that kind of standing. Not 5 or 6 feet of stone rising above a carefully prepared ground surface with evidence of a massive organized effort to raise them. These are smaller. Most of them are between 2 and 4 feet tall, and they are set into the ground rather than simply balanced on it, which means that someone went to the trouble of digging into the rocky soil of this ridge and setting these stones in place with enough care that they have remained upright for however long they have been there. There are 11 of them, arranged in a rough arc that opens toward the southeast. The southeast. In the morning sky, in the early weeks of February, when you stand at the center of that arc, you are looking directly at the point on the horizon where the sun rises. This is what researchers who have found their way to this ridge have noted. February 1st or thereabouts, which sits almost exactly halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, the sunrise aligns with the opening of the arc in a way that seems too precise to be accidental. The stones frame the rising sun the way a picture frame frames a painting, with a kind of deliberate attention to placement that implies that the person who set these stones had stood on this ridge for years, perhaps for many years, watching the sky and noting where the sun emerged from the tree line and planning how to mark that moment in a way that would outlast them. We do not know who built this. We do not know when it was built. The stones cannot be dated the way that organic material can be dated, and there is no associated debris, no charcoal from a nearby hearth, no broken pottery, no discarded tools that would allow researchers to establish a cultural context and thus a rough date. The structure exists outside of time in the way that all stone structures eventually come to exist outside of time, permanent in a way that human lives are not, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. No one who has studied this site has done so under the auspices of any official institution. The man who first documented it did so in a spiral notebook with a pencil, sketching the arrangement of the stones and noting the azimuth of the February sunrise with a compass he had brought for the purpose, because he had heard about this place from an old man who had grown up nearby, an old man who said his grandfather had known about these stones and had called them by a name in a language the old man could not identify, a name that meant something like the place where the year turns. I am telling you this story at length because it is not an unusual story. The stones of the Ozarks have been documented, when they have been documented at all, not by professional archaeologists with institutional support and grant funding and graduate students to process the data, but by amateurs, by people with notebooks and compasses and weekend afternoons to spare, by retired school teachers and county historians and local curiosity seekers who drove down dirt roads because they had heard something from someone who had heard something from someone else. By people who did not have the credentials to publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals and who therefore published them in the newsletters of local historical societies, or in self-published booklets available at general stores and tackle shops, or who did not publish them at all but simply kept their notebooks and hoped that someone would eventually ask to read them. This is part of why the stones of the Ozarks remain so obscure, not because they are not there, they are there. But the pipeline that carries discoveries from the field to the academy and from the academy to the public has a very specific set of filters, and the stones of the Ozarks have, for reasons we will get into, consistently failed to pass through those filters. The question of why is worth sitting with for a while, because it is not a simple question, and the answer is not flattering to anyone involved. Part of the answer is practical. The Ozarks are rugged and large and imperfectly mapped, even now. The region covers something in the neighborhood of 50,000 square miles across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, with extensions into eastern Oklahoma and a corner of Kansas. Much of this land is privately owned, which means that access for researchers is dependent on the goodwill of landowners who may or may not be interested in having archaeologists tramping across their property, and who have, historically, had plenty of reasons to be suspicious of outsiders, with official credentials asking questions about what might be on or under their land. Much of the rest is public land, managed by the Forest Service or the National Park Service or state agencies, and the bureaucratic process of getting research permits for these areas is time-consuming and expensive, and tends to favor projects that fit neatly into established research priorities. And much of it is simply inaccessible. Not legally inaccessible, but physically difficult. Hollows choked with greenbrier and wild rose, bluffs that require technical climbing to reach the top, ridge lines where the cedar is so dense you can walk within 10 feet of a stone arrangement and not see it. The Ozarks hide things easily. The terrain is designed, if you will forgive the personification, to discourage casual investigation. But there is a deeper reason why the stones of the Ozarks have not received the attention they deserve, and it has to do with the story we have decided to tell about pre-Columbian North America. That story, as I mentioned, places the Ozarks at the margins. The Mississippian centers were in the river valleys to the east and south. The great earthwork building cultures of the Ohio Valley and the upper Mississippi were to the north. The complex agricultural societies of the southwest were to the west. The Ozarks, in this story, were in between everything, a place people moved through and around, rather than a place where significant things happened. This marginalization has had practical consequences. When professional archaeologists have gone into the Ozarks, they have tended to go looking for evidence that fits the existing framework. Evidence of the woodland period, evidence of Mississippian influence, evidence of the historic period tribes who lived in the region, the Osage, the Caddo, the Quapaw, the Delaware and Shawnee who were pushed west by colonial expansion. All of these are legitimate research interests, and all of them have produced genuine knowledge, but they've also, collectively, created a set of expectations about what the Ozarks should contain, and those expectations have made it harder to see what the Ozarks might actually contain. The stones do not fit those expectations, and when evidence does not fit expectations, there are two responses available. One is to revise the expectations. The other is to explain away the evidence. The second response is much easier, and it has been, in the case of the Ozarks, by far the more common one. Let me tell you about a man named Vine Deloria Jr., who was not an archaeologist, but who spent a significant portion of his career pointing out the ways in which American archaeology had structured itself to protect certain conclusions from scrutiny. Deloria, who died in 2005, was a Standing Rock Sioux scholar, lawyer, and activist, who is perhaps best known for his 1,969 book, Custer Died for Your Sins, which was a sharp and often very funny critique of American attitudes toward Native American peoples. But later in his career he turned his attention to archaeology and to what he saw as the discipline's systematic tendency to underestimate the capabilities and achievements of pre-Columbian peoples. In his 1995 book, Red Earth, White Lies, Deloria made a series of arguments that professional archaeologists found deeply uncomfortable, not because the arguments were unsophisticated, but because some of them were difficult to refute. He argued that American archaeology had organized itself around a set of founding assumptions, chief among them the assumption that complex, monument-building civilization in North America was a relatively late development, and that it could not significantly predate the recognized centers of Mississippian and woodland culture. He argued that evidence that did not fit this assumption was systematically ignored, explained away, or attributed to the activity of colonial-era Europeans rather than to pre-Columbian peoples. He was not, it should be said, arguing for the kinds of fringe theories that attribute the mounds of the Ohio Valley to ancient Hebrews, or the earthworks of the Mississippi to Egyptians, or any of the other diffusionist fantasies that have plagued the study of pre-Columbian North America since the 18th century. He was arguing something more pointed and in some ways more unsettling, that indigenous peoples in North America were fully capable of building complex monuments, that they had done so over a much longer period and in a much wider range of locations than the established archaeological consensus acknowledged, and that the failure to recognize this was not an accident, but a structural feature of a discipline that had been built, in part, to serve particular ideological functions. Deloria was writing specifically about earthworks and the Kennewick Man controversy and other high-profile disputes, not about the stone structures of the Ozarks, but his arguments apply. The Ozarks are exactly the kind of place where the structural biases he identified operate most powerfully, because the region is peripheral in every relevant sense: geographically peripheral, institutionally peripheral, culturally peripheral, and the people who might have built the stone structures are not there to advocate for a more careful investigation of the evidence. Let me try to give you a sense of the variety of what has been found, because it is easy to speak abstractly about stone structures and lose sight of the concrete particularity of individual sites. In the Arkansas portion of the Ozarks, in the mountains around the Buffalo River and its tributaries, there are cliff faces marked with petroglyphs that include geometric designs, spirals, and what appear to be celestial representations. These have been officially documented, which makes them unusual. What is less officially documented, though widely known among local historians, is that many of these petroglyphs are associated with stone walls and cairns at the tops of the bluffs above the cliff faces, as if the cliff face markings and the ridgetop structures formed parts of a single complex. The official interpretation of these petroglyphs tends to attribute them to the historic woodland or early Mississippian periods, roughly 500 to 2,000 years ago. This attribution is based primarily on stylistic comparisons with petroglyphs from other sites with better dating, but stylistic comparison is a notoriously unreliable dating method, particularly in a region like the Ozarks where the cultural sequence is poorly understood, and there are researchers who believe that some of the Arkansas petroglyphs are significantly older than the official consensus. How much older? Here is where it gets interesting. In 2019, a team of researchers examining the Buffalo River petroglyphs using a technique called optically stimulated luminescence dating, which can date the last time certain minerals were exposed to light, obtained preliminary results suggesting that some of the pigment associated with the petroglyphs had been last exposed to light between 4,000 and 6,000 years before present. This would place the creation of at least some of these images in the Archaic period, a time when the conventional archaeological wisdom says that the people of this region were not yet producing the kind of organized cultural expression that would leave deliberate marks on cliff faces. These results have not been published in a peer-reviewed journal. They exist in a preliminary report that circulates among a small community of interested researchers. I mention them not to claim that they are certainly correct, but because they illustrate a pattern. Results that challenge the established narrative tend to remain in the grey zone of preliminary and unpublished for much longer than results that confirm it. In the Missouri Ozarks, there is a complex of structures in the hill country south of the Missouri River that was documented in the 1980s by a retired civil engineer named Lloyd Bush. Bush was not a trained archaeologist. He was a man who had spent his career building bridges and roads, which meant he had a certain kind of eye for how stone behaves when it is being used for structural purposes, for the difference between stone that has simply fallen where gravity put it and stone that has been placed to achieve a specific end. He spent 8 years exploring a roughly 20 square mile area of rough hill country, documenting what he found in meticulous notebooks that combined precise measurements with hand-drawn maps and photographs. What he found, in that 20 square mile area, was something that he described as a landscape-scale system of stone architecture. Walls that connected ridges to bluffs to bottomland terraces in configurations that suggested, to his engineer's eye, a planned drainage and water management system. Cairns at high points that formed, when plotted on a map, a geometric pattern too regular to be explained by chance. Stone-lined pits that he interpreted as storage features, based on their dimensions and their locations relative to what appeared to be associated structures. Most controversially, he found what he described as an enclosed ceremonial space on a high ridge, a roughly oval area defined by a low stone wall open to the northeast, with a large flat stone at its center that bore traces of what appeared to be deliberate shaping. Bush took his documentation to the Missouri Archaeological Society. He took it to the University of Missouri. He took it to the State Historic Preservation Office. In each case, he received a version of the same response. The structures he had documented were interesting, certainly, but the most parsimonious explanation was that they were the work of European settlers clearing their land. The wall alignments could be explained by the topography. The cairns were probably boundary markers. The enclosed space was probably a livestock pen, or possibly a structural feature associated with a long-vanished homestead. Bush did not accept these explanations. He had spent 8 years in that landscape, and he knew what European field-clearing walls looked like because there were plenty of them in the area, and they did not look like what he was describing. He spent the remainder of his life, another 12 years after his initial documentation, trying to get someone with institutional authority to take his findings seriously. He did not succeed. He died in 2001. His notebooks are in the possession of his family, who have made copies available to a small number of researchers. I have read excerpts of these notebooks, and I will tell you honestly that they are not the work of a crank. They are the work of a careful and methodical man who found something he could not explain and tried, with the tools available to him, to document it as honestly as he could. There is a concept in the study of archaeology and related fields called the Overton window, borrowed from political theory, which refers to the range of ideas that are considered acceptable for serious academic discussion at any given time. The Overton window in American archaeology has shifted significantly over the past several decades in some areas, most notably in the acceptance of a pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas and in the recognition of the scale and complexity of Amazonian civilization. But it has shifted much less in other areas, and one of those areas is the question of complex stone-using cultures in the upland South. The reason for this is partly practical. The upland South, which includes the Ozarks and the Ouachitas and the Cumberland Plateau and several other related geographic areas, has simply not been the focus of the kind of sustained, well-funded archaeological research that has been directed at the Ohio Valley or the Mississippi floodplain or the Southwest. The research infrastructure is thinner. The institutional presence is weaker. The number of trained archaeologists working in the region at any given time is smaller, and so the window for what is considered established knowledge is narrower, because there is less knowledge to establish. But there is also an ideological dimension. The upland South has a complicated cultural politics, and the question of who was here before European colonization and what they achieved has been, for various reasons, entangled with those complicated cultural politics in ways that have not always served the cause of careful inquiry. Let me try to be specific about this, without oversimplifying. The Ozarks were, by the time of sustained European contact in the early 19th century, relatively thinly populated compared to regions like the Mississippi Valley or the southern Appalachians. The dominant historic period presence in the region was the Osage, a powerful and sophisticated people whose territory in the late 18th century extended across much of what is now Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The Osage are still here. They are a federally recognized tribe with a government and a homeland in what is now northeastern Oklahoma, and they have an active and legitimate interest in questions about the prehistory of their ancestral territory. But the Osage, like most tribes, did not build in stone. Their material culture was centered on hide and wood and earth, on structures that were meant to be assembled and disassembled as the seasonal round demanded. The stone structures of the Ozarks, if they were built by indigenous peoples, were not built by the Osage as we know them from the historic period. They were built by someone earlier, someone whose identity and relationship to the historic period peoples of the region is unclear. This creates a delicate situation. To investigate the stone structures seriously, to argue that they represent a significant pre-Columbian cultural presence in the Ozarks, is implicitly to argue that the region's prehistory is more complex than the standard narrative allows, that there were peoples here, before the Osage, who achieved things that have gone largely unrecognized. This is not a politically neutral argument in a region where the politics of land and history and cultural identity are still very much alive. Let me tell you about the place called Alum Cove. Alum Cove is a natural feature, a large sandstone alcove or rock shelter in the Boston Mountains of northwest Arkansas, in what is now a recreational area managed by the Ozark National Forest. It is a genuinely beautiful place. The alcove is perhaps 200 feet wide and 50 feet deep, its ceiling a sweeping curve of pale sandstone, its floor a flat shelf of exposed rock above the hollow below. A small stream runs nearby, and in wet seasons a waterfall drops from the rim of the alcove. The Forest Service trail to Alum Cove is well maintained and moderately popular. Hikers come to see the natural bridge, another sandstone feature nearby, and to look at the alcove itself, which is impressive by any standard. What the trail signs do not tell you, what the Forest Service brochures do not mention, is that the walls of Alum Cove bear petroglyphs, not just a few scattered marks, but a substantial collection of incised designs, including geometric forms, a possible representation of a human figure, and what several researchers have described as a series of marks that appear to represent a calendar or tally of some kind, a sequence of grouped lines that, when counted, yield numbers that correspond to significant astronomical intervals. These petroglyphs are known. They have been documented. They appear in the records of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, the state agency responsible for managing the archaeological heritage of Arkansas. They are classified, officially, as of unknown age and cultural affiliation, which is the standard designation for sites that cannot be confidently assigned to a known cultural context. Around the alcove and on the ridge above it, there are stone structures. A low wall that runs along the edge of the ridge above the alcove for perhaps 200 feet. a small cairn at a high point on the ridge that commands a view of several miles of valley below. And, most intriguingly, a series of stone-lined features in the floor of the alcove itself, features that are partially obscured by centuries of accumulated debris but that, when carefully examined, appear to include at least one structured hearth and what may be the remains of a stone-walled storage feature. None of this has been excavated. None of it has been formally studied. It sits in the records as unknown, unclassified, unresolved, waiting for someone to ask the questions that would begin to resolve it. Why has no one asked those questions? Partly because the resources do not exist. The Arkansas Archaeological Survey operates on a budget that requires prioritization, and a rock shelter with ambiguous petroglyphs and ambiguous surface features does not rise to the top of the priority list when there are Mississippian sites being damaged by plowing and woodland mounds threatened by development and 100 other pressing concerns. Partly because the institutional culture of American archaeology tends to reward research that produces clean results, that fits into established frameworks, that can be published in journals that accept papers written according to certain methodological conventions. Ambiguous sites with ambiguous features do not produce clean results. And partly, I think, because the questions that Alum Cove raises are questions that the established framework is not well equipped to answer, questions that would require a different kind of investigation than the kind that American archaeology has traditionally favored. What kind of investigation would that be? This is a question that a small number of researchers have been working on, in various ways, for several decades, and their answers have not been warmly received by the mainstream of their disciplines. One approach is what might be called landscape archaeology. Rather than focusing on individual sites in isolation, trying to understand each site's stratigraphy and artifact assemblage and cultural affiliation, landscape archaeology tries to understand how sites relate to each other and to the natural features of the landscape in which they sit. It asks questions like, why here? What is special about this location that made it worth the effort of building something? How does this structure relate to other structures in the surrounding area? How does it relate to the topography, the hydrology, the astronomical conditions of this specific place? When you apply these questions to the stone structures of the Ozarks, some patterns begin to emerge. The structures tend to cluster in specific types of locations: high ridges with broad views, the tops of bluffs above significant rivers, the edges of natural glades or clearings in the cedar, the mouths or interiors of significant rock shelters. These are not random locations. They are locations that share certain characteristics: prominence, visibility, access to water, and in many cases, specific astronomical alignments. The astronomical dimension is worth dwelling on because it is one of the more consistent patterns in the data. A researcher named Glenn Emery spent 20 years, working largely alone and on his own time and his own money, surveying stone structures in the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks and recording their orientations. He was not looking for astronomical alignments specifically. He was simply trying to understand the geometry of the structures to see whether there were patterns in how they were oriented. And what he found, when he began to analyze his data, was that a disproportionate number of the stone features he had documented were aligned to one of three azimuths: the sunrise at the summer solstice, the sunrise at the winter solstice, and the sunrise at one of the cross-quarter days, either Groundhog Day or its opposite number in late October or early November, which in the old agricultural calendar was known as Samhain, cross-quarter days, the days that fall halfway between a solstice and an equinox. This is interesting because cross-quarter days mark the points of the year when the change from one season to another is most decisively underway. In a subsistence economy, in a world organized around the seasonal round of hunting and gathering and, perhaps, some degree of cultivation, these are critical moments in the year. Knowing when they are coming, being able to predict them with precision, could be the difference between adequate preparation and disaster. Emery published his findings in a 2007 monograph that he printed himself and distributed to libraries and to anyone who asked him for a copy. He sent copies to every professional archaeologist in the region he could identify. He received, in response, 2 polite acknowledgements and 1 form letter. No one engaged with his data. No one pointed out what, if anything, was wrong with his methodology. No one replicated his survey. His monograph is available in several Missouri and Arkansas libraries, and it has been cited by a handful of researchers working in related areas, but it has not entered the mainstream discussion of Ozark's prehistory. Glenn Emery died in 2014, His field notes are with his daughter, who has made them available to researchers on request. I want to pause here and be careful about something. I am not telling you that the stones of the Ozarks are proof of a secret civilization. I am not telling you that there were advanced pre-Columbian peoples in the American interior who have been deliberately hidden from public awareness by a coordinated academic conspiracy. I do not believe either of those things, and I think they are not useful frameworks for thinking about the evidence. What I am telling you is that there is evidence. Evidence that has been documented, often by careful and methodical people who brought genuine skills to the task of documentation. Evidence that has been acknowledged, at least in the sense of being formally recorded by official agencies. Evidence that sits in archives and notebooks and unpublished reports, not because it has been studied and found to be unimportant, but because it has largely not been studied at all. And I am telling you that the reasons it has not been studied are worth understanding, because they illuminate something important about how we decide what questions to ask and what evidence to take seriously. The Ozark stone structures have fallen through the gaps of a research infrastructure that was not designed to catch them. They do not fit the established periodization of Ozark's prehistory. They do not fit the methodological preferences of mainstream archaeology. They do not fit the institutional priorities of the agencies responsible for managing the region's cultural heritage. They are ambiguous, and ambiguity is expensive, but ambiguity is not the same as meaninglessness. And the accumulated weight of what has been documented in these hills by all these quiet, persistent, largely unrecognized researchers amounts to something that deserves more careful attention than it has received. Let me tell you about the Mark Twain National Forest. The Mark Twain is the national forest that covers most of the Missouri Ozarks, some 1.5 million acres of mixed hardwood and cedar forest, karst topography, wild rivers and deep hollows. It is managed by the United States Forest Service, which has a formal responsibility under the National Historic Preservation Act and several related statutes to identify, protect, and manage the cultural resources on the land under its jurisdiction. The Forest Service takes this responsibility seriously in many respects. There are archaeologists on staff at the Mark Twain, and they have conducted surveys of portions of the forest land base and have recorded many sites in the official National Register database. The forest has an active heritage program that sponsors public archaeology events and educational programs, and yet, there are areas within the Mark Twain National Forest that have been surveyed, formally and officially surveyed by trained archaeologists, where stone structures of the kind I have been describing were documented and then classified as historic, meaning as dating to the period of European-American settlement, and therefore as falling outside the scope of the protection afforded to pre-Columbian sites. I have spoken with several people who have direct knowledge of these surveys. They describe a process that was, by their accounts, conducted in good faith, but that was structured by assumptions that made certain conclusions almost inevitable. The assumption that stonewall features in the Ozarks are the product of European-American land clearing unless proven otherwise. The assumption that the burden of proof for pre-Columbian attribution is high and that ambiguous features should default to the historic category. The assumption, perhaps most importantly, that the kind of investigative work that would be required to resolve the ambiguity is not justified by what is at stake. I want to be fair. These are not unreasonable assumptions in the abstract. European-American settlers did clear enormous amounts of stone from their fields, and they did so using methods that can produce wall-like features. The burden of proof for extraordinary claims should be high, and the Forest Service's resources are genuinely limited. But the assumptions become problematic when they are applied in a systematic way to an entire class of features without serious investigation of whether the assumptions are warranted in specific cases. When the same determination is made, again and again, by different surveyors in different parts of the forest, on the basis of the same set of assumptions, and when that determination consistently forecloses further investigation, then what you have is not rigorous science but the self-perpetuating application of a prior conclusion. There is a hollow in the southern part of the Mark Twain. I will not name it because the people who know it well are protective of it, for reasons that will become apparent, that contains one of the more complete examples of what researchers in the area call an integrated stone complex. An integrated stone complex, in the vocabulary of Ozarks amateur archaeology, is a site where multiple types of stone features occur in spatial association with each other in a way that suggests they were part of a single planned construction rather than the accumulated result of multiple unrelated activities over time. The hollow I am describing contains all of the following. Within an area of roughly 4 acres, a series of low stone walls that define what appears to be a series of terraced levels on the slope above the hollow's stream. A large cairn, perhaps 8 feet in diameter and 4 feet high, at the highest point within the defined area. A stone-lined fire pit or hearth at the base of the cairn. Several smaller cairns at lower elevations that appear to have sightline relationships with the main cairn and with each other. A flat stone surface near the stream that bears what appear to be grinding marks, and a rock shelter in the bluff face above the hollow whose floor shows signs of repeated occupation over a long period. This site has been visited by perhaps a dozen people who have any kind of research interest in Ozark's prehistory. It has been photographed, it has been sketched, it has been measured, partially. One researcher conducted a limited surface collection in the rock shelter and found what she described as abraded chert flakes consistent with tool use over an extended period. It has not been excavated. It has not been formally recorded with the Missouri State Historic Preservation Office. It has not been studied by anyone with the resources and institutional backing that would be required to establish its age, its cultural affiliation, and its significance. It is simply there, in its hollow, as it has been for however long it has been there, waiting. The silence around these sites has its own texture. When you talk to local people, to the people who grew up in these hills and whose families have lived here for 4 or 5 or 6 generations, you find that many of them know about the stones. Not in an organized, research-oriented way, not with the vocabulary of archaeology, but in the way that people know the features of a landscape they have lived in all their lives. They know which ridge has the funny walls on it. They know about the cairn that their great-grandmother used to call the Indian pile. They know about the rock shelter where the old carvings are that nobody has ever figured out. This knowledge exists in the community, but tends not to travel from the community into the institutional structures that might do something with it. The people who have it do not necessarily think of it as the kind of knowledge that archaeologists would be interested in, and in some cases they are right, because archaeologists have not always been gracious in their interactions with local communities in the Ozarks. There are stories, circulating in the folk history of the region, of instances where a local person told an archaeologist about a site. The archaeologist came to look at it, declared it unimportant or misattributed it, and left, leaving the local person with the impression that their knowledge was not valued. I cannot verify these stories individually, but they describe a pattern that is consistent with what is known about the history of archaeology's relationship with rural communities more broadly, and they help explain why there is sometimes a reluctance to share information about significant sites with people who are perceived as official investigators. The knowledge is there. The sites are there. What is missing is the bridge between them and the kinds of institutional attention that would allow them to be studied seriously. Let me tell you about a different kind of evidence. Not stones, for a moment, but water. The Ozarks are karstic terrain, meaning that they are underlain by carbonate rocks, primarily dolomite and limestone, that are soluble in slightly acidic water. Over millions of years, groundwater moving through the rock has dissolved it along fractures and bedding planes, creating a vast underground drainage system of caves and sinkholes and springs and disappearing streams. The Ozarks have more caves per square mile than almost any comparable area in North America, and their spring systems are among the largest and most complex on the continent. This underground hydrology shaped the lives of the people who lived in the Ozarks in ways that we are only beginning to appreciate. The springs, which emerge from the ground at constant temperatures, cold and clear and reliable, were critical resources in a landscape where surface water could be scarce in dry years. The caves provided shelter and, in many cases, served as ritual spaces. The sinkholes, where the roof of an underground void has collapsed, created microhabitats with unusual species assemblages that skilled gatherers could exploit. But there is something else about the springs, something that has been noted by researchers working in various parts of the Ozarks and that has not been fully integrated into the standard understanding of Ozark's prehistory. Many of the major springs, the big ones that produce hundreds of gallons per minute even in dry years, are associated with stone structures, not casually associated, not in the sense that there are a few scattered stones nearby, which you would expect in any part of the Ozarks regardless of human activity, associated in a more specific sense. Walls that run toward the spring from higher ground, cairns at specific distances from the spring head, that, when the spring head and the cairns are plotted together, form geometric patterns, flat stone surfaces near the spring that bear traces of modification. This association between springs and stone structures is suggestive. Springs, in many indigenous American religious traditions, are understood as thresholds, as places where the underground world and the surface world communicate, as locations of particular spiritual power. Ethnographic accounts from various tribes who have historical connections to the Ozarks describe springs as places where ceremonies were conducted, where offerings were made, where communication with non-human powers was sought. If the stone structures near Ozark Springs are pre-Columbian in origin, they may reflect a tradition of spring veneration that goes back very deep into the region's history. The largest spring in Missouri is Big Spring, which issues from a cave at the base of a bluff on the Current River in Carter County, in the southeastern part of the Ozarks. At its peak flow, Big Spring produces over 800 million gallons of water per day. It is one of the largest springs in the world. It is now managed as part of the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. The bluff above Big Spring bears petroglyphs. They are recorded. They are ambiguous in age and cultural affiliation. Near the springhead, there are stone features that have been classified, in the official records, as historic. There are people who have spent time at Big Spring with more than a tourist's attention, who have walked the bluff above the spring and looked carefully at what is there, who believe that the stone features near the spring head are not historic. They believe they are old. They believe they are associated with the petroglyphs on the bluff. They believe that Big Spring was, for a very long time before European Americans arrived in this part of the country, a place of deliberate human intention. They may be wrong, but they have not been proven wrong. They have simply been told, in various ways, that the question is not a priority. There is a mountain in the Arkansas Ozarks called Pedestal Rock, named for the natural rock formation that crowns its summit, a column of sandstone balanced on a narrower base that has the appearance of a deliberate sculpture, though it is in fact the product of differential erosion. From the summit of Pedestal Rock, on a clear day, you can see 50 miles in every direction across the rolling corrugations of the Boston Mountains. The summit of Pedestal Rock is surrounded by stone structures. These structures are not subtle. They are not the kind of low, ambiguous alignments that require careful attention to distinguish from natural rubble. They are walls, actual walls, built of flat stones laid in courses, running in an approximately circular pattern around the summit platform, interrupted in several places by openings that face specific directions. At several of the openings, larger stones have been placed upright, flanking the gap the way gateposts flank a doorway. The structures at Pedestal Rock have been known to local people for as long as local people have been climbing the mountain, which is to say for at least a century and a half. They appear in accounts from the mid-19th century written by travelers and naturalists who are struck by their apparent regularity and deliberateness. They have been photographed and described in the publications of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. They have been formally recorded. They have been classified as of unknown age and cultural affiliation. A researcher named Barbara Hartman, a retired geologist who had spent her career working in the oil fields of Oklahoma and Arkansas, began studying the Pedestal Rock structures in 2003 after her retirement. She brought to this study the same skills she had spent her career applying to the analysis of rock formations, an ability to read stone as a record of process, to distinguish between what rock does when it is shaped by geological forces and what it does when it is shaped by human hands. Her conclusion, developed over several years of field study and documented in a report she completed in 2009, was that the structures at Pedestal Rock were constructed, not accumulated. That the stones in the walls had been selected for size and shape, that many of them showed evidence of having been worked to improve the fit, and that the overall organization of the structures reflected planning and intention rather than casual accumulation. She estimated, based on the labor required to construct the walls she documented, that the structures at Pedestal Rock represented something on the order of 5,000 person-hours of organized labor, not the kind of labor that a single family or a small band of hunters would undertake, the kind of labor that implies a larger social organization, a community commitment, a shared purpose. Hartman sent her report to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. She received an acknowledgement. She followed up several times over the following years. She was told, consistently, that the survey's resources did not permit a formal evaluation of her findings. She died in 2017. Her report is in the files of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, and it is available to researchers. The Arkansas Archaeological Survey, let me say something about it, because it is important and because it is easy, in a narrative like this one, to cast official agencies purely as obstacles, and that would not be fair or accurate. The Arkansas Archaeological Survey was established by the Arkansas Legislature in 1967, and it has been, in many respects, a model for how a state archaeological agency can be organized. It has research stations across the state, associated with universities. It has a publication program. It conducts public education and outreach. It works to protect significant sites from damage and destruction. It operates, like all such agencies, under constraints of budget and personnel and mandate that make it impossible to study everything that deserves study. The people who work there are, in my understanding, genuinely committed to the careful investigation of Arkansas prehistory. But the survey operates within a research paradigm that has not, historically, been well calibrated to the questions raised by the Ozark stone structures. The paradigm emphasizes excavation, artifact recovery, and cultural historical synthesis. It is organized around the goal of fitting sites into the established cultural historical framework, of assigning them to periods and traditions and ethnic groups that are recognized within the standard narrative. Sites that do not fit into the standard narrative, that raise questions the paradigm is not designed to answer, tend to remain unresolved, not because anyone decides they should remain unresolved, but because the path from ambiguous surface feature to resolved attribution leads through a kind of research that the paradigm does not prioritize. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural problem, the kind of problem that affects any research enterprise that has organized itself around particular methods and questions. The methods and questions were chosen for good reasons. They have produced genuine knowledge, but they have also created blind spots, and the Ozark stone structures are in one of those blind spots. I want to tell you about a theoretical framework that some researchers have found useful for thinking about the stone structures, not because I want to advocate for this framework as the correct explanation, but because it opens up some ways of thinking about the evidence that the standard archaeological framework forecloses. The framework comes out of archaeoastronomy, which is the study of how ancient peoples understood and used astronomical knowledge. Archaeoastronomy has had a complicated history in American scholarship. When it was first proposed as a legitimate field of inquiry in the 1970s and 80s, it was greeted with considerable skepticism, some of which was warranted because some of the early claims were genuinely overreaching, and some of which was the kind of disciplinary conservatism that treats any new approach as suspect until it has demonstrated its utility many times over in safe and uncontroversial contexts. But archaeoastronomy has, over the past several decades, established itself as a legitimate and productive field, particularly in the context of Mesoamerican and Southwestern archaeology, where the evidence for astronomical orientation of monumental architecture is strong enough to compel recognition. The great temples of Chichen Itza are oriented to receive the light of the sun in specific ways at specific times of year. The buildings of Chaco Canyon incorporate astronomical alignments that required sustained observation and careful planning over multiple generations. This is no longer seriously disputed. The question is whether the same kind of intentional astronomical orientation can be demonstrated for smaller and more ambiguous features in regions like the Ozarks, where the structures are not monumental in scale and the cultural context is poorly understood. The archaeoastronomers who have worked in the Ozarks argue that it can, and they point to the statistical patterns that Emery and others have documented. The clustering of orientations around the solstices and cross-quarter days, the consistency of these patterns across sites widely separated in space, the specificity of some of the alignments. They argue that while any individual alignment might be explained as coincidental, the pattern as a whole, if it is real and not an artifact of selective reporting, constitutes meaningful evidence of intentional orientation. The critics of this argument point out, correctly, that the risk of finding patterns in ambiguous data is always high, that human beings are very good at finding patterns whether or not those patterns are real, and that without rigorous statistical testing of a complete and unbiased sample of sites, it is difficult to know whether the apparent clustering of orientations is genuine or an artifact of the way the data was collected. Both of these positions are reasonable. The way to resolve the disagreement is obvious. Conduct a rigorous survey, document all of the stone features in a defined study area, without pre-selecting for particular types of features, record their orientations systematically, and apply appropriate statistical tests. This has not been done. It has not been done because no one has had the resources to do it. The archaeoastronomers who might want to do it do not have the field survey capacity. The archaeologists who have the field survey capacity do not consider it a priority. Let me change direction for a moment and talk about something that might seem tangential, but that I think is actually central to understanding why the Ozark stone structures matter, regardless of who built them and when. The Ozarks are changing, not in the slow way that geological change happens, not in the way that rivers gradually shift their courses or caves slowly enlarge their passages, but in the rapid and irreversible way that happens when human activity transforms a landscape faster than any natural process. The population of the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks has been growing for decades, driven by retirement migration, by the expansion of recreational development around lakes and rivers, by the conversion of agricultural land to suburban development. The forests are being fragmented. The springs are being developed. The bluffs that were once accessible only to those willing to scramble up unmarked trails are now topped by vacation cabins with decks overlooking the valleys. And as this development proceeds, the stone structures are being disturbed, not usually deliberately, not with any awareness that they are being disturbed. People building cabins on ridgetops, people constructing driveways and walking paths and landscaping features, people simply moving through the landscape with machinery are disturbing stone arrangements that have sat undisturbed for however long they have been there. The disturbance is often total and irreversible. A wall that has stood for 1,000 years, or 2,000, or 5, is just rubble to a bulldozer. This is not unique to the Ozarks. It is happening everywhere. But it is happening in the Ozarks with particular speed, and in a context where the structures that are being disturbed have not been recorded, and where the knowledge that would allow them to be recognized is not widely distributed. There is a practical urgency to the question of the Ozark stone structures that goes beyond the academic question of what they are and who built them. They are disappearing. Whatever they are, whatever they mean, whatever they might tell us about the human past of this region, they are being lost faster than they can be documented, let alone studied. I want to tell you about one more person before we go deeper into the landscape itself. Her name is Mary Jones, and she grew up in the Arkansas Ozarks, in a family that had farmed the same hollow for 6 generations. She is in her 70s now, and she has spent most of her adult life doing what people in that part of the world have always done, farming and raising animals and knowing her neighbors and knowing her land. Mary Jones knows about stones. She knows about them not in the abstract way that archaeologists and researchers know about them, but in the intimate way that comes from living in a landscape for 70-odd years and paying attention to it every day. She knows which of the stone features on her family's land were built by her great-grandfather when he cleared the field above the creek, because she has seen the photographs of him doing it and has talked to people who remember it. And she knows which ones were already there when her great-grandfather arrived, were already there when the first Europeans came to this part of the country, were already there in a way that the family always recognized, always treated with a certain kind of deference that she is not quite sure how to describe except to say that you did not mess with those stones. The stones that her family did not mess with are on a high ridge above the hollow. There are perhaps 30 of them, arranged in a pattern she has known since childhood, a roughly elliptical arrangement with a larger stone at what she thinks of as the top. When she was a girl, an older neighbor, a man who was then in his 90s and who had grown up before there were any paved roads in that part of the county, told her that those stones had been there as long as anyone could remember, and that people used to go there, back before his time, at certain times of year, to do something that he did not have a name for, but that he described as paying attention. Paying attention. I like that phrase. It has the feel of something translated from a different way of thinking about the relationship between human beings and the landscape they inhabit. Mary Jones has talked to archaeologists. 2 or 3 of them, over the years, have come to look at the stones on the ridge. They have been polite. They have taken photographs and measurements. They have told her that the stones are interesting and that they will look into them further. None of them has come back. She is still there, in her hollow, and the stones are still on the ridge above it, and she still goes up there sometimes, at certain times of year, and pays attention. The question of what, specifically, the stone structures of the Ozarks might tell us about the region's pre-Columbian past is a question that requires sitting with a considerable amount of uncertainty. We do not know who built them. We do not know when they were built. We do not know what purpose they served. We have patterns, suggestive patterns, but not the kind of evidence that would allow confident conclusions. What we can say, with some degree of confidence, is that the structures are there, that they are distributed widely across the plateau, that they share certain characteristics that suggest at least some degree of commonality in their origins or their purposes, and that they have been systematically under-investigated. We can also say something about what their presence implies, not about who made them or when, but about the intellectual framework we use to think about pre-Columbian North America. The presence of elaborate stone structures in the upland interior of North America, far from the recognized centers of the major pre-Columbian civilizations, is not, in principle, surprising. The Ozarks sit at the center of the continent. They were surrounded by cultures of considerable sophistication. The Mississippians to the east and south, the Hopewellian cultures to the north, the cultures of the Arkansas and Red River valleys to the west. The plateau itself, with its abundant game and plant resources and reliable water supply, was an attractive place to live. There is every reason to think that the people who lived here over the past several thousand years were capable of building things, and of building things that were organized around specific purposes, including ceremonial purposes. The surprise is not that there might be elaborate pre-Columbian stone structures in the Ozarks. The surprise is that we have spent the past 2 centuries largely not looking for them, and that when they have been found, we have largely not studied them. Let me tell you about the geometry. One of the more consistent findings from the researchers who have studied the spatial distribution of the Ozarks stone structures is that the structures are not randomly distributed. They cluster. They cluster in specific types of locations, as I mentioned earlier, but they also cluster in ways that suggest something about the spatial logic of whoever built them, about how that unknown builder or those unknown builders organized their understanding of the landscape. When you plot the locations of documented stone features on a topographic map, certain patterns emerge. Features at high points tend to have visual relationships with other features at other high points, relationships that allow a person standing at one feature to see one or more other features. This sightline pattern is consistent across a significant portion of the documented sites. Why would this matter? In a landscape without writing, without paper maps, without the ability to record and transmit geographic knowledge in permanent form, the ability to orient yourself visually, to triangulate your position by reference to known landmarks, is critical. A network of highly visible features, cairns or standing stones or wall segments on prominent high points, would serve as a kind of distributed navigation system, a way of marking the landscape with human intention in a way that would be readable across significant distances. This is speculative, but it is a kind of speculation that is grounded in what we know about how other cultures, in other parts of the world, have organized stone features in the landscape for navigational and territorial purposes. The hill forts of Iron Age Britain, the cairn networks of the Scottish Highlands, the stone tower systems of the American Southwest, all represent different expressions of the same basic logic. Mark the high places, create a visual network, make the landscape legible. The Ozarks may contain a version of this logic. If so, it would be consistent with what we know about the sophistication of the cultures that inhabited the region's margins, the Mississippians, the Hopewellians, and their predecessors, and it would suggest that the interior of the plateau was more integrated into the broader social and economic systems of pre-Columbian North America than the standard narrative has recognized. There is a stretch of the White River in the Arkansas Ozarks where the river cuts through what geologists call the Springfield Plateau that has been known to fossil hunters and amateur archaeologists for decades as one of the richest areas for surface finds in the region. The gravels of the White River carry chert from dozens of geological formations, and in those gravels, worked by the river and then exposed by low water or by gravel bar movements, you can sometimes find stone tools, projectile points and scrapers and cores that were left by people who worked those gravels for their tool-making material, probably over a very long period. But the White River Gorge, where the river cuts down through the plateau, is also associated with a concentration of stone features on the bluffs above the river that is remarkable by the standards of what has been documented in the broader region. On a stretch of about 15 river miles, there are documented stone walls at the tops of at least 7 bluff faces. These walls do not all look the same. Some are simple, a single course of flat stones laid along the bluff edge. Others are more substantial, 2 or 3 courses high, with what appear to be reinforcing features at intervals. A few of them have been damaged by the construction of the lake that now covers much of the lower White River, because when Lake Bull Shoals was impounded in the 1950s, it drowned a significant portion of the lower White River Gorge, and in doing so destroyed or damaged an unknown number of sites that were not recorded before the inundation, because the archaeological survey that was supposed to be conducted before the dam was built was inadequate. This is an old story in American reservoir archaeology. The survey is too limited, the reservoir is too large, the time is too short, and much is lost. Lake Bull Shoals, Lake Table Rock, Lake of the Ozarks, Truman Lake, Norfolk Lake, and a dozen other reservoirs in the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks were all impounded during the mid-20th century, and all of them drowned cultural resources that were not fully recorded. The stone features above the surviving portions of the White River Gorge are the remnant of what was once, in all likelihood, a more extensive complex. What we have now is a fragment, and even that fragment has not been seriously studied. Let me tell you something that might be the strangest part of this story. In the early years of European-American settlement in the Ozarks, which means roughly from the 1790s through the 1840s, there are accounts in letters and diaries and early newspapers of stone structures that were encountered by the first waves of settlers coming into the region from Tennessee and Kentucky and other parts of the upland South. These accounts are interesting because they describe things that the settlers themselves found puzzling. These were not people who were unfamiliar with old stone walls. They came from parts of the country where there were plenty of old walls built by earlier generations of European-American settlers, and in some cases, attributed to pre-Columbian peoples in ways that were sometimes accurate and sometimes fanciful. They knew what a field-clearing wall looked like, and some of what they found in the Ozarks, they said, was not that. A letter from 1818, written by a man named Josiah Gregg, who later became famous for his account of the Santa Fe Trail, but who in 1818 was a young man exploring the Ozarks with a group of hunters and traders, describes coming upon a series of stone walls on a ridge in what is now Shannon County, Missouri. Gregg writes that the walls enclosed a space of several acres, and that they appeared to have been built with great care by some people who were not European. He notes that the walls are old, that the lichen on them is thick, and that trees growing on top of some of the fallen sections have trunks of considerable diameter. Tree rings. A tree growing on top of a collapsed wall will be no older than the collapse, but its age gives you a minimum date for that collapse. A tree with a large trunk might be 150 or 200 years old, which would place the collapse of the wall, at the latest, in the mid to late 1600s, before significant European-American presence in that part of the country. Gregg's letter is in a collection at the Missouri Historical Society. It has been read by researchers. No one has gone back to Shannon County to look for what he described. There are other accounts. An 1832 account in the Arkansas Gazette describes stone structures near the Buffalo River that the writer describes as Indian works of unknown age. An 1847 account in a Missouri newspaper describes a stone enclosure in the Gasconade Hills that the writer estimates, on the basis of the growth of trees within it, to be very old. These accounts are not scientific documentation. They are impressionistic. They are subject to all the biases and misperceptions that early frontier accounts are subject to. But they constitute a kind of independent historical testimony to the existence of stone structures in the Ozarks that were, at the time of earliest European-American contact, already old enough that the settlers who encountered them were uncertain of their origin. I keep coming back to the silence, not the silence of the Ozarks themselves, which is not silent at all, which is filled with the sound of wind in the cedars and water over limestone, and the calls of birds that have been calling in these hills for millions of years. I mean the institutional silence. The silence that greets these sites in the official record, the silence of the peer-reviewed journals, the silence of the grant agencies, the silence of the university departments, where the questions that these sites raise could, in theory, be pursued. There is something about that silence that has always struck me as itself meaningful, not in a conspiratorial way, not because I believe that there is a coordinated effort to suppress knowledge of pre-Columbian complexity in the Ozarks. I do not believe that. But because the silence is a structural feature of the way we have organized the production of knowledge about the past, and structural features tell you something about the values and assumptions of the system that produces them. The silence says, this is not important enough to investigate. It says, the questions this evidence raises are not questions we are organized to answer. It says, whatever is there, it is not worth the effort and expense and professional risk that a serious investigation would entail. And embedded in that silence is a particular view of what the Ozarks were and what the people who lived there before Europeans arrived were capable of. The silence implies a low ceiling of capability, a limited horizon of achievement, a kind of pre-Columbian provincialism that placed the interior of the continent beyond the reach of the complex and intentional and organized human activity that was, apparently, happening everywhere else. Maybe that view is correct. Maybe the stone structures of the Ozarks are exactly what the conventional interpretation says they are. The casual and unintentional accumulation of rock clearing by European settlers and the occasional natural feature that resembles a wall to an undiscriminating eye. But I do not think that is what they are. And I think the weight of the documented evidence, taken seriously and evaluated honestly, does not support that conclusion. Let me tell you about what it is actually like to find one of these structures, because I think that experiential dimension matters and tends to get lost in the kind of abstract discussion I have been engaged in. You are walking a ridge in the spring, when the trees are just beginning to leaf out and the wildflowers are at their peak in the glades. Bloodroot and trout lily and spring beauty, hepatica on the north-facing slopes, and the cedar glades opening onto bluff tops where the view goes on and on across valleys that are still winter pale below you. You have been walking for an hour, and you are not on a trail. You are navigating by your memory of a topographic map and by the feel of the terrain, following the ridge toward a high point that seemed, when you looked at the map, like a place worth visiting. You are not looking for anything in particular, you are just walking, and then something changes in the way the light falls on the ground ahead of you, and you slow down, and you look more carefully, and you realize that what you are seeing is not how the ground looks when rocks have simply settled into the soil over a long time. It is how the ground looks when someone has placed rocks with a purpose. It is a low wall, not much more than knee-high, if it were fully intact, but it is not fully intact. It has been tumbled by freeze-thaw and root action and simple time, and what you see is more of a linear rubble than an upstanding wall. But the linearity is unmistakable. Rocks do not line up like this by accident, not over this distance, not with this consistency. And as you follow the line with your eyes, you see that it curves gently, and you begin to understand that you are standing inside an enclosure. You walk the enclosure. It takes you perhaps 10 minutes, because it is not small. You estimate that it covers something in the neighborhood of a quarter acre. The wall defines its perimeter on 3 sides. The 4th side is the bluff edge, which drops perhaps 40 feet to a cedar-choked slope below. The opening in the wall faces west, and you check the time and note that you are here in the late afternoon, and the sun is perhaps an hour above the horizon, and it is setting almost exactly in the direction the opening faces. You stand at the center of the enclosure. You feel something, though you resist naming it because naming it would probably make it smaller. You look out through the opening at the setting sun, and you understand, suddenly and with great certainty, that whoever stood in this exact spot and placed these stones in this exact configuration understood something about this place, about what it is like to be a human being standing on this ridge at the end of a day in early spring, watching the sun go down. You do not know who they were. You do not know when they were here. But you know, with the kind of knowing that lives in the body rather than the mind, that they were here, and that they paid attention to this place in ways that mattered to them, in ways that they believed were worth marking with stone. The experience I just described is not mine alone. It is the experience that a number of researchers and ordinary visitors to these sites have described, often in similar terms. The encounter with the structure produces a kind of recognition, a sense that you are in the presence of intention, of human thought that expressed itself in permanent form and has been waiting, in its patience, for someone to recognize it. This recognition is not scientific evidence. Feeling does not constitute proof. But it is worth noting because it is consistent, because it recurs across a wide range of visitors to a wide range of sites, and because it stands in sharp contrast to the experience of encountering genuinely natural stone features which do not produce the same response. People who work in the field of environmental psychology, which is the study of how human beings respond to and interact with their environments, have noted that human beings have a robust ability to detect intentionality in arrangements of objects, an ability that was shaped by evolution because the ability to distinguish between random arrangement and intentional arrangement, between the accidental pile of leaves and the deliberate trap, between the natural rock formation and the territorial marker, was a matter of survival. This ability can certainly produce false positives, can perceive intention where none exists. But it can also be calibrated by experience, by learning what natural stone accumulation looks like in a given geological context, and then recognizing what does not fit, The people who have walked the Ozarks long enough to know what natural stone accumulation looks like in this specific landscape tend to recognize the structures. They tend to recognize them as different, as other, as bearing the signature of intention. Their recognition may be wrong, but it is not arbitrary. There is a relationship between this landscape and the sky that I have not yet fully articulated, and I want to try to do that now, because I think it is central to understanding why certain locations in the Ozarks became the focus of whatever human activity the stone structures represent. The Ozarks are at a latitude, roughly between 35 and 38 degrees north, where certain astronomical events have particular visual drama. The summer solstice sunrise, when you are at 36 degrees north, rises from the northeast at an azimuth of about 58 degrees, which means it comes up from a specific and identifiable point on the horizon. The winter solstice sunrise, at the same latitude, rises from the southeast at an azimuth of about 122 degrees. The difference between these two azimuths is 64 degrees, which is a significant swing across the horizon over the course of a year. From a high point in the Ozarks, a high point with good views to the east, the progression of the sunrise from its summer extreme to its winter extreme and back again is a dramatic and visually compelling cycle. The sun rises from behind a specific ridge or tree line or bluff edge at midsummer, and over the following months it rises progressively further south, until at midwinter it rises from a completely different point, behind a completely different ridge or tree line or bluff edge. A person who spent their life on a particular high point, watching this progression, would develop an intimate knowledge of the horizon's features and of how the sun related to them at different times of year. This is not a sophisticated astronomical observation in the sense of requiring mathematical knowledge or specialized instruments. It is the kind of observation that emerges naturally from sustained attention to the sky in a specific place. And it is the kind of observation that, once made and recognized as meaningful, motivates the placement of markers, of ways of recording the position of the sun at particular moments, of monuments to the sky's relationship with the earth. The stone structures at high points in the Ozarks, particularly those with documented solar alignments, may be the product of exactly this kind of sustained sky watching, this intimate topographic astronomy that emerges from the long-term occupation of a specific landscape by a people who paid attention. I want to talk about something that happened in 1988 in the Douglas County area of Missouri. That seems to me like a small but telling example of how the institutional response to anomalous sites operates in practice. A man named Robert Barnes, who was at the time a high school history teacher in the town of Ava, received word from a student's family that there was something unusual on their farm property, a series of stone features on a ridge that the family could not explain. Barnes went to look. What he found, by his account, was a complex of stone walls and cairns that extended across perhaps 2 acres of ridgetop, with evidence of considerable age and considerable intentionality. Barnes did what a responsible person in his position would do. He contacted the State Historic Preservation Office of Missouri, which referred him to the University of Missouri Archaeological Survey. He contacted the local chapter of the Missouri Archaeological Society. He contacted a professor of anthropology at Missouri State University in Springfield. The State Historic Preservation Office sent a form letter acknowledging his report. The Missouri Archaeological Survey told him that a site visit was not possible with current staffing. The local chapter of the Missouri Archaeological Society expressed interest but was unable to act without institutional backing. The professor at Missouri State agreed to look at his photographs and told him that the features looked interesting but were probably the result of European-American field clearing. Barnes continued to document the site himself. He took systematic photographs over several years. He drew detailed maps. He measured the orientations of the wall segments. He compiled his documentation into a report that runs to 83 pages, and that includes everything a preliminary site report should include. He submitted this report in 1993 to the State Historic Preservation Office, the Missouri Archaeological Survey, and the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. He received acknowledgments from all three. None of them conducted a follow-up visit. The farm has since been sold. The new owners do not know about the stone features, or do not know what they might be. Barnes has no access to the property. He is in his late 70s now. His report is in a filing cabinet. This is the accumulation. Robert Barnes and Lloyd Bush and Barbara Hartman and Glenn Emery and the handful of others I have named, and the many more I have not named, people who went into the hills and looked carefully and documented what they found and then tried, through whatever channels were available to them, to get someone with the authority and resources to look at what they had found. Notebooks in filing cabinets, reports in the files of agencies, photographs in boxes in attics, the work of a lifetime, or of a decade, or of a long retirement, sitting in the grey zone of acknowledged but unstudied. The accumulation is real. If you wanted to, you could spend a year doing nothing but reading the documentation that these researchers have produced, visiting the archives where it is held, talking to the families of those who have died and to the survivors who are still working. You would find, at the end of that year, that you had encountered a body of evidence that does not resolve neatly into any of the standard categories of archaeological knowledge, but that constitutes, in its totality, a serious challenge to the standard narrative of Ozark's prehistory. Not a definitive refutation, not proof of any specific claim, but a serious challenge, a body of evidence that demands a more careful response than it has received. Let me tell you about the caves. I mentioned earlier that the Ozarks have more caves per square mile than almost any comparable area in North America. This is true, and the caves of the Ozarks have their own complex story in relation to the pre-Columbian past of the region. Caves in the Ozarks were used by pre-Columbian peoples. This is not in dispute. There is extensive evidence of cave use, ranging from simple utilization of dry cave chambers for shelter and storage to what appear to be more deliberate and structured uses that suggest something beyond simple utility. The cave, known as Graham Cave, in Montgomery County, Missouri, is one of the most important archaeological sites in the Ozarks, though it is not a cave in the tourist cave sense, more of a large rock shelter. Graham Cave contains evidence of human occupation extending back approximately 10,000 years, making it one of the earliest well-documented human occupations in the Ozark region. The stratigraphy of Graham Cave is now a baseline for understanding the Ozarks' cultural sequence, but Graham Cave is not representative of the full range of cave use in the region. Graham Cave was used in a way that archaeologists recognize and are comfortable with. People sheltered there, left artifacts, cooked food, created a stratigraphic record that can be excavated and analyzed. The evidence from Graham Cave fits the standard framework. Other caves present a different kind of evidence. In several caves in the Salem Plateau area of Missouri, in the caves that feed the springs along the Current River and its tributaries, there is evidence of what appears to be deliberate alteration of the cave environment. Stone walls built inside cave chambers, not the crude walls that might be built for a functional shelter, but walls with a character more like the ones found on the surface above. Flat stones laid in courses, oriented in specific directions, forming enclosures within the cave that have no obvious utilitarian function. There are also, in some of these caves, marks on the walls. Not the spectacular polychrome paintings of the French caves, not Lascaux or Chauvet, nothing like that. These are simpler marks, incised lines, geometric designs, grouped scratches that might be tally marks. They are located deep in the caves, past the reach of daylight, in sections that would have required deliberate expedition with artificial light to reach. The marks have been documented by speleoarchaeologists, archaeologists who work in caves, and they exist in the official record as of unknown age and cultural affiliation. The walls have been noted by cave explorers, but have not been the subject of formal archaeological investigation. The conjunction of surface stone structures and subsurface stone structures, of marks above ground and marks below it, suggests to some researchers a unified conceptual framework in which the cave and the ridgetop were understood as the two poles of a single sacred geography, the underground world and the sky world bracketing the human world of the surface. This is interpretation. It goes beyond what the evidence strictly demonstrates, but it is the kind of interpretive hypothesis that should be testable if anyone were willing to design a research program around it, and its testability is part of what makes it interesting. The human geography of the Ozarks, the distribution of people across the landscape and the networks that connected them, is something we understand poorly for most of the pre-Columbian period. We know more about the end of the period, the centuries immediately before European contact, because the Mississippian cultures that dominated the surrounding regions left durable evidence in the form of earthen mounds and ceramic assemblages that allow archaeologists to trace trade networks and population movements. But the interior of the Ozark Plateau is poorly integrated into even our late pre-Columbian understanding. What we do know is that the Ozarks were not empty. They were occupied, through the full extent of the pre-Columbian period in North America, by a succession of peoples whose social and economic organization we understand imperfectly. The Dalton culture, perhaps 10,000 years ago, left their distinctive projectile points in the gravels of the Current River and the White River. The archaic peoples who followed left a more diffuse material signature that is harder to trace but that indicates long-term occupation of the uplands. The woodland peoples of the First Millennium Common Era are better represented, with burial mound complexes in the river valleys and evidence of horticulture in the more productive bottomlands. Through all of these periods, people were living in the hills. They were hunting deer and turkey, and collecting hickory nuts and pawpaws and persimmons and black walnuts. They were quarrying chert for their tools from the rich chert formations of the Springfield Plateau. They were fishing the rivers and collecting mussels from the gravel bars. They were, in short, doing what successful people do in a productive landscape, using it intensively and intelligently over a long period of time. The stone structures may be the expression of that long-term intelligent use. Not monuments in the sense of celebrations of power or wealth, not necessarily ritual spaces in the sense of dedicated sacred precincts, though they may have been that too, but perhaps something more integrated with the daily and seasonal life of the people who built them. Markers of a landscape that was known deeply, known over generations, known with the kind of knowledge that leaves deliberate marks. There is a researcher, a young woman who completed her doctoral dissertation at a university in the Midwest several years ago, who is doing something that no one has done before in the Ozarks. She is conducting a systematic, landscape-scale survey of stone features in a defined study area using LiDAR data, which is airborne laser scanning that can detect surface features through vegetation cover combined with ground-truthing fieldwork. She is doing this as part of a study that is formally framed as an investigation of historic period land use, because that framing was necessary to obtain her grant funding, but she is collecting data on all stone features regardless of apparent age, and she is doing so with a methodological rigor that the previous documentation efforts in the region have not achieved. She has not published her findings yet. They are embargoed pending publication. I have spoken with her, and she has told me that the data are interesting, that they are revealing patterns in the distribution of stone features that the standard framework does not easily accommodate, and that she is working carefully to ensure that her analysis is as rigorous and defensible as possible before she puts it into the public domain. I am not going to tell you what she has found, because it would not be fair to her to do so before she has published. But I will say that there is research underway, serious and methodologically sophisticated research, that is bringing new tools to bear on the questions raised by the Ozark stone structures. And whatever the results of that research turn out to be, the fact that it is happening represents a shift, a small but real shift, in the institutional willingness to take these questions seriously. The moon. I want to talk about the moon for a moment, because it has come up in the research on the Ozark stone structures in ways that I find compelling. The moon's cycle of waxing and waning takes approximately 29.5 days, which is where the concept of the month comes from. But the moon also has a longer cycle, an 18.6-year cycle, during which the point of its rising and setting on the horizon swings through a range that is significantly wider than the sun's annual range. At its maximum, the moon rises as far north and sets as far north as any object can rise and set from a given latitude. At its minimum, 18.6 years later, it rises and sets at the extreme south. These extremes are called the major lunar standstill and the minor lunar standstill, and they have been recognized as significant by cultures around the world, most famously in the construction of monuments like Stonehenge that appear to incorporate alignments to the lunar standstills. The lunar standstill cycle has been proposed as a relevant framework for understanding some of the stone structures in the Ozarks. The proposal is based on the observation that some of the structures that Emery and others have documented have orientations that fit the lunar standstill azimuths better than they fit the solar solstice azimuths. If this is correct, it would suggest that the builders of these structures were tracking the moon's 18.6-year cycle, which in turn would imply a level of sustained astronomical observation and institutional memory, the ability to pass knowledge across nearly 2 decades, that is more demanding than simple solstice observation. This is speculative. The evidence for lunar alignments in the Ozark structures is weaker than the evidence for solar alignments, partly because there are more lunar azimuths to check against and therefore a higher risk of finding apparent alignments by chance. But it is a hypothesis that deserves investigation, and it illustrates the kind of question that a serious research program focused on the Ozark stone structures would ask. I have been talking for a long time now about absence, about what has not been studied and what has not been published and what has not been acknowledged. Let me try in this section to be more constructive, to talk about what a serious investigation of the Ozark stone structures might look like and what it might be able to tell us. The first and most basic need is documentation. Comprehensive, systematic documentation of all stone features in a defined study area, conducted with consistent methods and recorded in a form that allows comparison across sites and regions. The LiDAR-based approach being used by the researcher I mentioned is one way to do this. Ground-based survey by trained teams is another. What is needed is not a handful of researchers working independently with their own methods and their own notebooks, but a coordinated effort that produces a standardized dataset. The second need is dating. Without dates, all interpretation is provisional. Several methods are potentially applicable to the Ozark stone structures, including optically stimulated luminescence, dating of sediment associated with the structures, cosmogenic nuclide dating of exposed rock surfaces, and in cases where organic material is associated with the structures, radiocarbon dating. None of these methods is cheap or easy. All of them require laboratory analysis and specialized expertise, but they are the only way to move from pattern recognition to historical understanding. The third need is comparative analysis. The Ozark stone structures need to be analyzed in relation to the broader context of pre-Columbian stone architecture in eastern North America. There is more of this than is generally recognized. Stone walls and enclosures have been documented in the Cumberland Plateau, in the Appalachians, in the Ouachita Mountains, in the Ozarks of eastern Oklahoma. These sites share certain characteristics with the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks features, and a systematic comparison might reveal patterns that illuminate the cultural affiliations and chronological relationships of the structures. The fourth need, and perhaps the most important, is community engagement. The knowledge that local communities, both non-indigenous and indigenous, hold about the Ozark stone structures is a critical resource that has not been adequately accessed by researchers. The Osage Nation, as the primary historic period indigenous community with connections to the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks, has a legitimate interest in questions about the prehistory of their ancestral territory and potentially holds oral traditions and other forms of knowledge that would be relevant. Non-indigenous communities in the region hold the kind of localized landscape knowledge that Mary Jones represents, knowledge that is not written down and not formal, but that is real and potentially invaluable. A research program that engaged these communities seriously, that was designed to incorporate their knowledge rather than simply extract information from them, would be more likely to succeed both scientifically and in terms of building the social trust necessary for sustained investigation. Let me return to the landscape for a moment, because I do not want to lose sight of the physical reality of what we are talking about. The Ozarks are beautiful. This is not a trivial observation. The beauty of the landscape is part of what shaped the behavior of the people who lived there, part of what made certain places feel significant, worth marking, worth returning to. The beauty is not uniform. It concentrates in certain places, at certain times of year, in certain combinations of light and water, and rock and sky. On a clear evening in October, when the hardwoods are at their peak color and the maples on the north-facing slopes are burning orange and red against the dark green of the cedars, when the light is going gold and the shadows in the hollows are already purple with twilight, when the rivers are running clear over their gravel bars and the sound of water over rock carries up the valley walls, the Ozarks achieve a kind of perfection that is genuinely hard to describe without resorting to language that sounds excessive. People have been living in this beauty for 14,000 years. Some of them responded to it the way people respond to great beauty, by trying to mark their presence in it, by trying to build something that would last, by trying to create a relationship between themselves and the landscape that would survive them. The stones on the ridges are, among other things, an expression of that impulse. Whatever else they are, whatever purposes they served, whatever knowledge they encoded, they are evidence that the people who built them looked at this landscape and felt something that moved them to respond, to act, to leave a mark. There is an old story, told in various forms by people across the Ozarks who have grown up in proximity to these hills, about a time before the time that anyone can remember, a time when the hills were different, when there were more people and more knowing, when the stones that are now scattered and forgotten were still standing and were still understood. The story varies in its details. In some versions, it is about the people who made the stones. In other versions, it is about what the stones were for. But most versions share a common thread, the idea that something was lost, that a knowledge that was once present is now absent, that the stones are a kind of remainder of something that used to be whole. I do not know what to do with this story exactly. It is not evidence in any sense that would satisfy a researcher looking for datable, testable information. But it is interesting that the story exists at all, that the cultural memory of the Ozarks contains, in various forms, a recognition that the stone structures represent something that has been partially forgotten, something that demands to be remembered. Maybe that is what these stories are for. Not to provide accurate information about who built the structures or when, but to keep the structures in consciousness, to ensure that they are not simply naturalized, not simply incorporated into the landscape as ordinary features, rather than recognized as the intentional marks they appear to be. The story does what the institutional structures have failed to do. It keeps the question alive. There is a spring in the hills of Shannon County, Missouri, not far from the area where Josiah Gregg described the stone walls he encountered in 1818, that most people have never heard of, and that most people would never find without a guide or very detailed directions. The spring issues from a cave mouth at the base of a dolomite bluff, emerging from the darkness of the rock into a pool of extraordinary clarity, cold even in August, surrounded by watercress and cardinal flower and the sound of its own voice, which is a deep, resonant sound because the cave mouth amplifies it the way a cupped hand amplifies a whisper. Above the spring, on the bluff face, there are marks. Not petroglyphs in the elaborate figurative sense. Simpler than that, a series of parallel incised lines, perhaps a dozen of them, running vertically down the face of the rock above the cave mouth. They are partly obscured by lichen and by weathering, but they are there, and they have been there long enough that the lichen has grown over them rather than around them, which tells you something about their age, though not exactly how old they are. And around the spring, in the flat ground between the cave mouth and the creek that carries the spring's water away, there are stones. Not a wall, not a formal enclosure, but a cluster of stones that have been arranged, if you look carefully at them, in a rough circle around the pool. Not all of the stones are in their original positions. Some have been moved, probably by people accessing the spring over the years. But the arrangement is still visible, and the scale of it, and the way it centers on the pool, suggests intention. Who made these marks? Who arranged these stones? How long ago? We do not know. We may never know. Absent the kind of investigation that has not been conducted and may not be conducted in time, before whatever subtle signals of age and use that remain in the site are finally obliterated by the patient work of time. But standing at this spring, in the late afternoon, when the light comes over the bluff and catches the surface of the pool at an angle that makes it look like hammered silver, it is very difficult to believe that the marks in the stones are not the work of someone who stood where you are standing and felt what the place made them feel, and responded in the only way available to them, by making something, by leaving something, by saying in the permanent language of stone, I was here, and this mattered. I want to try to bring together some of what I have been saying into something that approximates a conclusion, though I want to be honest about the fact that this story does not have a conclusion. It is not a story with an ending. It is a story that is still unfolding, that is still generating new evidence and new questions, that will not resolve until there is a sustained, serious, well-resourced investigation of the kind that has so far not happened. What I have tried to do tonight is lay out the case for why that investigation is needed. Not the case that the Ozark stone structures are the remains of a great pre-Columbian civilization, because we do not know that and the evidence does not yet support that claim. Not the case that there is a conspiracy to suppress knowledge of these structures, because that framing is not accurate and not useful, but the case that there is real evidence of a real phenomenon, a widespread pattern of stone construction across the Ozark Plateau that has no adequate conventional explanation, and that this evidence has been systematically under-investigated for reasons that have more to do with the structure of academic research than with the quality of the evidence itself. The stone structures of the Ozarks are there. They are numerous. They have been documented imperfectly and by people without institutional support, but documented nonetheless. They exhibit patterns that suggest intentionality, not random accumulation. They are being lost as the landscape changes around them, faster than they can be studied. And the people who built them, whoever they were, whatever they understood, lived in a relationship with this landscape that was long and deep and intentional, and that left traces in stone because stone is what lasts. They knew that stone lasts. That was, perhaps, the whole point. The Ozarks are still there. You can go there. You can drive down the dirt roads of Shannon County or Carroll County or Newton County or Searcy County or Stone County, and you can park and walk into the hills and look at what is there with your own eyes. You do not need any particular expertise to recognize the difference between a natural pile of rocks and a deliberate arrangement of stones. You need patience and attention and a willingness to look carefully and slowly at what you are seeing. Some of what you will find will be perfectly ordinary. Old field-clearing walls and collapsed log cabin foundations and the debris of a century and a half of European-American settlement. These are interesting in their own way, and they will teach you, if you pay attention to them, what ordinary rural stone features look like in this landscape. And then, if you are lucky, and if you walk far enough, and if you go to the high places and the bluff tops and the edges of the glades, you may find something else, something that is not that, something that makes you stand very still and look very carefully, and ask yourself what you are seeing. Pay attention when that happens. The stones are there. They have been waiting, in their patience, for someone to notice. And every time someone notices, every time someone stands in front of one of these structures and takes it seriously, and records what they see, and asks the questions that the structure raises, that waiting is, in some small way, rewarded. There is one more thing I want to tell you before we drift towards sleep together. There is a way of being in the Ozarks that the people who lived here for thousands of years knew very well, and that most of us have forgotten how to do. It is the way of being in a landscape that requires sustained attention, that does not yield its knowledge easily, that asks you to come back again and again over years and seasons before it begins to show you what it contains. The Ozarks are not a landscape that reveals itself quickly. The terrain is complex and the vegetation is dense, and the features that matter most, the springs and the caves and the bluff tops and the seeded glades, are not always visible from the road. They require walking and time, and a willingness to be uncertain about where you are going and what you will find when you get there. The people who built the stone structures had that willingness. They spent lifetimes in these hills. They knew the ridge above their camp, the way we know the rooms of our own houses, knew every fold in the terrain, every spring, every exposure of good chert, every place where the sun came over the horizon in a particular way at a particular time of year. That knowledge was in their bodies, not just in their minds. It was the knowledge of people who moved through a landscape daily, season after season, generation after generation, until the landscape became an extension of themselves. The stones they left are the traces of that knowledge. They are, in a sense, a map of what it felt like to know this place that deeply. Not a map in the sense of a diagram that represents the landscape from above, but a map in the sense of a record of what mattered, of where significance concentrated in this particular piece of the earth. We have lost the ability to read that map. We have the stones, but we have lost the language. The challenge for anyone who wants to understand the stone structures of the Ozarks is not just the challenge of dating and documenting and interpreting the physical evidence. It is the more fundamental challenge of learning to ask the right questions, of finding a framework for inquiry that is adequate to what the evidence actually presents. That is a harder problem than it sounds. It requires not just better methods, but a different relationship to the unknown, a willingness to sit with questions that may not have clean answers, to follow evidence into territory where the standard maps do not apply. The researchers who have spent their lives working on these questions, the Lloyd Bushes and the Barbara Hartmans and the Glenn Emerys and all the others, have been doing something that looks, from outside, like stubbornness or eccentricity, but that is actually, I think, something more admirable. They have been paying attention. In the tradition of the best kind of inquiry, they have been refusing to be satisfied by explanations that explain the evidence away. They have been insisting that the evidence deserves better. The stones deserve better. The Ozarks deserve better. And somewhere in those hills, on ridges that most people will never climb, in hollows that most people will never enter, in glades that most people will never find, the stones are still there, waiting with the patience of stones, for someone to bring the same quality of attention to them that the unknown builders who placed them brought to this landscape 10 centuries ago, or 20, or 50, or more. The fire has burned down to coals now, in whatever imaginary camp we have been sitting in together through these hours. The stars are where they always are, the same stars that look down on whoever set those stones in place on those ridges, the same stars they watched with enough patience and care to encode the knowledge of their rising and setting into the landscape itself. The wind in the cedars sounds the way it always has. The spring somewhere below the ridge is still speaking in its deep cave-amplified voice. And somewhere on a high point in the Ozarks, Stones are standing in the arrangement they were placed in by hands that are gone, in the service of an intention that we have not yet understood. This is enough for tonight. Let it settle, whatever it has stirred. Let the mystery be a mystery, not a problem demanding immediate solution. The stones have waited this long. They will wait a little longer. And when morning comes, and you are back in whatever version of the ordinary world you inhabit, perhaps you will carry a small piece of this with you, the knowledge that in a region that most people think they know, in the American interior that seems so thoroughly documented and so thoroughly understood, there are hills that contain things that have not yet been explained, that challenge what we think we know about who was here and what they understood, and how long the human story in this landscape really goes. The Ozarks keep their secrets well, but the stones are there, and the stones, as I said, are patient. Rest now. The hollow is quiet, the ridge is dark above the tree line. Somewhere in the distance, a great horned owl is marking its territory in the cedar, and the sound of it moves through the darkness like a word in a language we used to understand. Sleep well, but there is more to tell, and the night is long, and the stones are patient. So let us keep going a little further into these hills before we rest, because there is a dimension of the Ozark stone structures that I have not yet addressed, a dimension that touches on questions that go deeper than the usual questions of who and when and why. It touches on the question of what kind of knowledge we are dealing with when we talk about people who built structures aligned to solstices and cross-quarter days, people who organized their understanding of the landscape around the movements of the sun and the moon, people who chose high places and springs and cave mouths as the locations for their most deliberate acts of construction. We are talking about a way of knowing the world that is fundamentally different from the way that modern Western science knows the world. Not inferior, not primitive, not pre-scientific in the sense of being a failed attempt at what science later achieved. Different. Organized around different questions, using different methods, producing different kinds of knowledge that are useful for different purposes. The knowledge encoded in the Ozark stone structures, if our reading of them is even partly correct, is a knowledge of pattern and cycle, a knowledge of how the world repeats itself, how the sun moves through the same arc year after year with only tiny variations, how the seasons arrive in the same sequence though with different intensities, how the springs flow and the rivers rise and the animals move according to rhythms that can be predicted by those who have paid close enough attention for long enough. This is not a naive or unsophisticated knowledge. It is a knowledge that requires generations of careful observation to build and generations of careful transmission to preserve. The people who encoded it in stone were doing something that has the same fundamental character as the great scientific projects of any civilization. They were building a cumulative knowledge base, adding each generation's observations to those of the previous generation, refining the understanding, correcting the errors, preserving the results in a form that would survive the loss of any individual knower. The form they chose was stone. The form modern science chooses is paper, or increasingly digital storage. The underlying activity, the careful observation of patterns in the world and the deliberate preservation of that observation is the same. There is a question that has been hanging over this entire conversation, and I want to address it directly, even though I cannot answer it fully. The question is, where did these people go? If there were communities in the Ozarks sophisticated enough to build the structures we have been discussing, communities with the social organization to coordinate large construction projects, with the astronomical knowledge to orient those structures precisely, with the cultural continuity to maintain and transmit that knowledge over generations, what happened to them? Why are they not represented in the historical record of the region? Why do the historic period peoples of the Ozarks, the Osage and the Caddo and the Quapaw not seem to have direct cultural continuity with a stone-building tradition? These are legitimate questions, and I do not have complete answers to them. But I can offer some partial responses that I think are worth considering. The first is that we may be overstating the discontinuity. The Osage, the dominant historic period people in the Missouri Ozarks, have an origin story that locates their origins in the sky world and their descent to the earth through a series of transformations. Their ceremonial life was organized around a set of cosmological principles that included careful attention to the movements of celestial bodies. They divided their society into two moieties, the sky people and the earth people, and their ceremonies and their social organization were organized around the relationship between sky and earth. This cosmological framework is not inconsistent with a tradition that includes celestial orientation of constructed features. The Osage did not build in stone. Their architectural tradition was centered on bark lodges and later on tipis. But the cosmological ideas that would motivate stone construction, the understanding of the sky as a source of order and meaning, the recognition of specific astronomical events as marking important moments in the annual cycle, those ideas were present in Osage culture. Maybe there is more continuity than the surface evidence suggests. Maybe the Osage are the descendants of people who, in earlier times, under different conditions of population and resource availability, built in stone. Maybe the shift from stone construction to more mobile architectural forms reflects not a replacement of one people by another, but an adaptation to changing conditions, a cultural transformation within a continuous tradition. This is speculation, but it is the kind of speculation that a serious research program might be able to evaluate. The second partial response to the question of where they went is more uncomfortable to articulate, but I think it needs to be said. The people who built the stone structures of the Ozarks, if they existed as a distinct cultural entity with the characteristics I have been describing, may have been among the victims of the demographic catastrophe that swept through indigenous North America in the decades and centuries following European contact. The scale of this catastrophe is still not fully appreciated in the popular understanding of American history. The best current estimates suggest that the indigenous population of the Americas fell by somewhere between 50 and 90% in the century, following first sustained European contact, primarily from epidemic diseases to which indigenous peoples had no prior immunity. The diseases arrived in waves: smallpox and measles and typhus and influenza, and a dozen others, each wave killing those who had survived the previous one, each wave leaving communities weaker and less able to maintain the social structures that allowed them to function. The Ozarks were not directly contacted by Europeans until the 18th century, but the diseases traveled far ahead of any European presence. Epidemic disease reached the interior of North America decades before any European explorer set foot there. Communities that had no contact with Europeans, that had no knowledge of Europeans, were nonetheless devastated by diseases that traveled along the same trade routes that connected them to the rest of the continent. A community that had built and maintained stone structures over generations, that had the social organization and the institutional memory to do so, was a community that depended on continuity. Disruption of that continuity by epidemic mortality, by the loss of the elders who held the knowledge, by the fragmentation of social structure that results from the death of half or more of a community's population, could have severed the thread of knowledge and practice that connected the structure-building tradition to the surviving communities, leaving the stones in place but the understanding of them lost. This is not just speculation. It is a pattern that has been documented in other parts of the world where epidemic disease disrupted knowledge traditions. The loss of knowledge that accompanies sudden, catastrophic mortality is one of the most poorly understood aspects of the demographic disaster of European colonization. The current river is one of the clearest rivers in North America. Its water, filtered through miles of dolomite and chert, emerges from springs along its banks and from the karst aquifer that feeds it so clear that on a bright day you can see the bottom at a depth of 8 or 10 feet, can count the individual cobbles in the gravel bed. You can watch the smallmouth bass hovering motionless in the current and see the individual scales on their sides. People have been floating the current river in canoes and john boats since at least the 19th century, when settlers began building cabins along its banks and using the river as a highway through the rough country of the southern Missouri Ozarks. It is now a national scenic riverway, administered by the National Park Service, and it draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year who come to float and fish and camp along its banks. Most of them do not look up. If they did, they would see bluffs. The current river has cut down through the Springfield Plateau over millions of years, and along many stretches it runs between walls of exposed dolomite that rise 50 and 100 and sometimes 200 feet above the water. These bluffs are beautiful in a way that catches your breath. Pale grey and creamstone faces, often stained with red and orange and black by mineral seepage, carved by weathering into towers and recesses and overhangs, draped with ferns and mosses in the damper sections, bare and vertical and almost architectural in the drier ones. The tops of these bluffs, which most river floaters never reach because the terrain above the river is steep and the vegetation is dense, are where some of the most significant stone structures in the Missouri Ozarks have been documented. On bluff tops above the current river, in a stretch of perhaps 30 river miles, there are documented stone features at a density that is unusual even by Ozark standards. walls running along bluff edges, cairns at high points that command long views up and down the river corridor, what appear to be cleared or prepared surfaces at several locations, flat areas where the natural debris has been removed or rearranged in ways that suggest human activity. One of these locations, which I will call the River Bluff Complex for purposes of this discussion, was documented in the early 1990s by a man who had been floating the current river for 40 years and who had spent a portion of each trip, over the course of several decades, scrambling up the bluffs to look at what was on top. He accumulated a substantial record of his observations, including measurements and photographs and compass readings that he took systematically once he began to understand what he was dealing with. What he documented, when he compiled his observations, was a series of stone features that, when plotted on a map, formed a pattern that extended along the bluff top for nearly 3 river miles. The individual features were separated by intervals of roughly 500 to 700 feet, which he noted was not random, that it corresponded roughly to what a person standing at one feature could see to the next feature in each direction on a clear day, accounting for the curvature of the bluff. He published his documentation in the newsletter of a local conservation organization in 1994. It received no response from the archaeological community. Let me tell you about the oak trees. The Ozarks were covered, before European settlement, primarily by open woodlands dominated by oaks and hickories, with cedars on the south-facing slopes and the glades where the thin soil over the bedrock discouraged other trees. The openness of the pre-settlement woodland was maintained by fire, both natural lightning-caused fire and deliberate burning by indigenous peoples, who understood that open woodland was more productive for the game species they depended on than the closed canopy forest that develops when fire is excluded. The oaks of the Ozarks can be very old. Some of the large post oaks and white oaks in the less disturbed parts of the plateau are 300 and 400 years old, trees that were already mature when the first European American settlers arrived. Some are older. There are post oaks in the Ozarks that dendrochronologists, tree ring specialists, have dated to 600 or 700 years. These old trees sometimes mark significant places, not in any mystical sense, but in the practical sense that very old trees tend to occur in locations that were not disturbed by the agricultural clearing that transformed most of the Ozarks in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the places that were not cleared, the bluff tops and the steep hollow walls and the glade edges, are often the same places where the stone structures occur. There is an old post oak, perhaps 500 years old by the estimate of a forester who examined it, that grows from the center of a stone enclosure on a ridge in Carter County, Missouri. The enclosure is roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, defined by a low wall of flat stones. The post oak grows from the apparent center of the circle, its roots weaving through and around the wall stones on one side, its trunk nearly 3 feet in diameter. The age of the tree tells you something about the minimum age of the enclosure. A 500-year-old tree growing from the center of a stone circle is a tree that began its life in approximately the year 1500, a generation or so before Spanish explorers began to push north into what would become the American Southwest. If the tree established itself in the enclosure, which is the most natural interpretation, the enclosure was already there when the tree was a seedling. The enclosure is at least 500 years old. Is it older? The wall itself shows no sign of recent construction. The lichen on the stones is thick and uniform. Some of the stones have been pushed out of position by the root growth of the old oak and by other, smaller trees that have grown up inside the enclosure over the centuries. There is nothing about the enclosure that suggests it was built in the historic period, but 500 years is as far back as the tree can take us. For anything older than that, we need other methods. There is a concept in geology called deep time, the understanding that the Earth is old in a way that is genuinely difficult for human minds to hold, that the familiar landscape around us is the temporary result of processes that have been operating for billions of years and will continue to operate long after everything human has come and gone. The archaeologists and historians who work on the deep human past face a similar challenge, trying to hold in mind a scale of time that dwarfs what ordinary historical thinking can comfortably accommodate. 10,000 years, 20,000 years. The Clovis people at the end of the last ice age, leaving their distinctive projectile points in river gravels across the continent, are more distant from us in time than we are from the beginning of agriculture. The archaic peoples who built the first shell middens along the coasts of North America are as remote from the Mississippians as the Mississippians are from us. The stone structures of the Ozarks may span all of this time, They may include features built 10 generations ago, and features built 50 generations ago, and features that are significantly older still. We cannot know, without investigation, where on this timeline any specific feature falls. And this uncertainty is not a reason to dismiss the evidence. It is a reason to take the investigation seriously. Because if some of these features date to the Archaic period, to the time of the great cultural efflorescence that is documented in the shell-midden cultures of the coast and the river valley burial complex cultures of the interior, then we are looking at a tradition of stone construction in the Ozarks that is 3 or 4 or 5,000 years old. And a tradition that long is not a coincidence or an anomaly. It is a feature of this place, a persistent expression of how people who knew this landscape chose to mark their relationship with it over a very long time. That would be significant in itself, quite apart from any question of what the structures were for or what they tell us about the capabilities of the people who built them. Persistence is its own kind of achievement. To maintain a tradition across dozens of generations, to pass it down intact through the centuries, requires exactly the kind of social and cultural continuity that is itself a form of complexity, a form of achievement. The mounds. I should talk about the mounds because the Ozarks do have mounds, and the mounds complicate the picture in interesting ways. When most people think of pre-Columbian mounds in North America, they think of the great earthen monuments of the Mississippian culture, the platform mounds of Cahokia and Moundville and Spiro, the conical mounds of the Ohio Hopewell, the effigy mounds of the upper Midwest. These are impressive structures that have received the attention they deserve. The Ozarks have their own mounds, smaller in scale than the great Mississippian platform mounds, but present in significant numbers in the river valleys along the margins of the plateau. These mounds have been excavated, some of them, and they have been assigned to the late woodland and Mississippian periods, roughly 500 to 1500 years ago. This is not controversial. The Ozarks mounds fit reasonably well into the established cultural sequence, but there are also mounds in the interior of the plateau, on ridges and high points, and in the upland hollows, that are smaller and less regular than the valley mounds, and that have not been excavated and have not been formally classified. Some of these are clearly cairns of the type I have been describing throughout this discussion. Others are more substantial, mounded features of piled stone and earth that are harder to categorize. The relationship between the stone structures and these interior mounded features is one of the questions that a serious investigation of the Ozarks stone complex would need to address. Are they part of the same tradition? Are they contemporaneous? Are they culturally related to the valley mounds or to a different tradition entirely? We do not know. The questions have not been seriously asked, let alone answered. There is a cave in the hills of Ozark County, Arkansas, in the drainage of the North Fork of the White River, that has been known to local people for generations as the Writing Cave because of the marks on its walls. The marks are not the elaborate pictographs of the Southwest or the sophisticated polychrome paintings of the European caves. They are simpler than that. Incised lines and geometric forms and what appear to be tally marks, the kind of marks that people make when they are keeping track of something. The Writing Cave is on private land and is not open to the public. The family that owns the land has, over the years, allowed a small number of researchers to visit and document the marks. The documentation that exists describes the marks as covering several sections of the cave wall in 2 separate chambers and as representing at least 3 distinct styles that may or may not be contemporaneous. One of the researchers who visited the Writing Cave in the late 1980s was a geologist with an interest in archaeoastronomy who noticed that the cave entrance is oriented in a specific direction and that on one day each year, a day that falls in late October or early November, the light entering the cave in the afternoon illuminates a specific section of the marked wall in a way that appears too precise to be accidental, that seems, to use his word, designed. He published a brief description of this observation in a regional geological newsletter in 1991. He did not have the opportunity to return to the cave to verify his observation in subsequent years. The Writing Cave is still there, the marks are still on the walls. The light still enters at the same angle on the same day each year, because that is what light and caves and the annual cycle of the Earth's orbit do. They persist, independent of whether anyone is watching. I want to return to something I said earlier, about the institutional silence around the Ozark stone structures, and complicate it a little. The silence is real, but it is not absolute. There are researchers, working within institutions, who are aware of the evidence and who find it interesting. There are archaeologists at state universities in Missouri and Arkansas who, when asked, will acknowledge that the stone structures are a real phenomenon that deserves more investigation. There are Forest Service archaeologists who are personally curious about specific sites they have encountered in their surveys. What there is not, as far as I have been able to determine, is a coordinated, funded, sustained research program. There are individual researchers with individual interests, working within institutional constraints that make it difficult to pursue questions that fall outside the established research priorities. There are agency archaeologists who would like to do more but whose time and resources are committed to more pressing demands. The gap between private acknowledgement and public investigation is where the Ozark stone structures currently live. They are real enough to be known. They are not important enough, in the institutional calculus of research priority, to be systematically studied. Closing this gap will require either a change in the institutional calculus, which is a slow and uncertain process, or the application of resources from outside the institutional framework, which is what the amateur researchers I have been describing have been attempting, with limited success, for decades. What might actually move the needle is a combination of the two: serious amateur documentation that is rigorous enough to compel institutional attention, combined with an institutional champion willing to stake some professional credibility on the importance of the investigation. This combination has not yet emerged in the Ozarks. It may be emerging, slowly, in the work of the researcher whose LiDAR-based survey I described earlier, but we will not know until the results are published. The 11-Point River. The 11-Point is a river in the Ozarks that most people outside the region have never heard of, which is part of what makes it wonderful. It flows through some of the most remote country in Missouri, through hollows and bluffs that see almost no traffic except canoeists in summer and hunters in fall, through a landscape that has changed less in the past century than almost any comparable stretch of the Missouri Ozarks. The 11-Point is a spring-fed river, like the current, and it has the same extraordinary clarity. It runs through a canyon in places, with bluffs rising directly from the water's edge, and in other places it opens into broad gravel bar reaches where you can hear the water moving over the stones from a quarter-mile away. Along the 11-Point, in the bluff country of Howell and Oregon counties, there are stone features that have been documented by a small number of researchers over the past several decades. Some of these features are on bluff tops, like the ones I described above the current river. Others are at a different kind of location, at the mouths of tributaries, where small streams enter the 11-Point from the hills above. The tributary mouth locations are interesting because they are the kind of places that would have been significant to people who travelled the river. The entrance to a tributary is a landmark, a waypoint, a place where decisions about route and destination would have been made. If you are travelling up the 11-Point in a canoe and you need to reach a specific hollow in the hills above, you need to know which tributary to enter. A marker at the mouth of the right tributary would be useful in exactly the practical way. But the markers at tributary mouths along the 11-Point are not simply practical in their design. They have the same character as the structures at other locations. Carefully chosen flat stones, apparent orientation to specific azimuths, associated smaller features that suggest more than simple wayfinding. They are complex in a way that exceeds the requirements of practical navigation. Maybe they served both purposes. Maybe a stone structure at the mouth of a significant tributary was both a practical navigational marker and a ceremonial acknowledgement of the significance of that location, a recognition that this confluence of waters was a place worth marking in the permanent language of stone. This kind of multifunctionality, where a structure serves both practical and ceremonial purposes, is entirely consistent with what we know about how pre-Columbian peoples in other parts of North America organized their built environments. The great kiva complexes of the Pueblo world served both as community gathering spaces for social events and as ceremonial spaces for ritual. The platform mounds of the Mississippians were simultaneously elite residential and administrative spaces and ceremonial centers. The sharp distinction between the practical and the sacred that characterizes modern Western thinking was not necessarily how pre-Columbian peoples in North America organized their understanding of the built environment. The big spring I mentioned earlier, the one in Carter County on the Current River that produces 800 million gallons a day at peak flow, has a companion that most people do not know about. Not far from Big Spring, accessible by a walk of about a mile through rough country, there is a smaller spring. Much smaller in terms of flow, a trickle compared to Big Spring's torrent. But the smaller spring emerges from a cave that is large enough to enter, and it emerges at the base of a bluff that faces due east, which means that on the morning of the spring and fall equinoxes, the rising sun shines directly into the cave mouth. The cave has marks on its walls. The marks are inside the cave, past the zone of natural light, in a section that would have required an artificial light source to reach. They are geometric, concentric circles, parallel lines, and what appears to be a series of marks arranged in a radial pattern around a central point. A central point, a radial arrangement. Concentric circles. These are patterns that appear in rock art across a very wide range of cultures and time periods. Patterns that researchers of visual symbolism have noted tend to appear in contexts associated with astronomical observation, and with what might loosely be called cosmological mapping, the attempt to represent the structure of the universe in a symbolic form. I am not saying that the marks in this cave are a map of the universe. I am saying that the location and orientation of the cave and the character of the marks within it are consistent with a pattern that has been observed elsewhere and that has been interpreted provisionally and with appropriate uncertainty as evidence of deliberate cosmological symbolism. The cave has not been formally investigated. It is on private land. The landowner is aware of the marks and of the orientation of the cave entrance, because a researcher who visited the property told her about these features, and she found them interesting. She has not, as far as I know, had any official follow-up from state or federal agencies. Let me tell you about the people who are, right now, today, working to document and preserve what can still be documented and preserved. There are not many of them. A handful of researchers, most of them outside the academy, most of them working on their own time and their own money. A few amateur archaeologists with serious field skills who spend their weekends walking ridges and recording what they find. A handful of local historians who are trying to compile what is known before the people who know it are gone. A few members of regional archaeological societies who have enough interest in the stone structures to devote some of their limited time to the question. These people are doing important work. They are filling in gaps in the documentary record that will be important when, eventually, a more formal research program gets underway. They are preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost entirely. The knowledge held by landowners and long-term residents who know the sites on their land without having any particular vocabulary for what they know. They are also, frankly, in a race against time. The Ozarks are changing fast. Development pressure is intense in the most scenic areas. Land that was in the same family for 5 or 6 generations is changing hands at an accelerating rate, moving from people who have a personal relationship with it, who know its features and its history, to people who do not. Each such transfer carries a risk, that the knowledge held by the old family will not transfer with the land, that what the new owners see is simply scenery rather than a layered record of long human presence. There are things individuals can do. If you have access to land in the Ozarks, you can pay attention to the stone features on it. You can document them, even informally, with photographs and notes. You can contact your state historic preservation office and report what you have found, which creates at least a documentary record even if it does not trigger immediate investigation. You can connect with local historical societies and amateur archaeological groups, which are often the best repositories of the knowledge that has been accumulated about specific sites and areas. These are not small things. The documentary record that exists for the Ozark stone structures, inadequate as it is, was built by people who did exactly these things, who paid attention and recorded what they saw and shared what they knew. Every addition to that record is a contribution to the eventual investigation that these sites deserve. The night is deep now. The fire I have been imagining has burned low, just coals and the occasional small flame where a piece of wood has not yet fully burned. The stars that were brilliant an hour ago are dimmer now, not because they have moved or changed, but because your eyes have adjusted to the darkness, and the darkness has become simply the darkness, ordinary and unfrightening. In the hills above whatever hollow you are imagining, the stone structures are what they always are at night, invisible, waiting, unmoved by the passage of hours. The stones have been through thousands of nights just like this one, many thousands. Whatever happened on the night they were placed, whatever ceremony or observation or act of marking was being performed, that night is as inaccessible to us as any single night in the past. We have the stones. We do not have the night. This is the fundamental condition of archaeology. You always have the artifact and not the life. You have the tool but not the hand that made it. You have the structure but not the intention. You have the mark on the rock, but not the voice that spoke whatever words accompanied the making of the mark. The distance is not infinite. You can narrow it, carefully and with appropriate humility, by bringing all available evidence to bear, by asking good questions, by being honest about what the evidence supports and what it merely suggests, but it never closes entirely. What you are left with, in the end, is something like what you experience at night when you look at a star whose light left it before you were born. The light is real, the star is real, or was real. The distance between them and you is real. And yet here you are, receiving the light, feeling the reality of it on your face and in your eyes, connected across an interval that ought to be unbridgeable by the simple fact that the light is still traveling, still arriving, still present. The stones of the Ozarks are still traveling, in their way, still arriving, still present. There are a few places in the Ozarks where the stone structures are dense enough and varied enough to suggest something more integrated than isolated individual features. Places where you can walk for a mile and see walls and cairns and clearings, and what appear to be work surfaces and occasional marks, all in an area compact enough that they seem to belong together, to constitute not a collection of separate features but something that was planned as a whole. One of these places is in the White River Hills of northern Arkansas, in country that is now largely protected as part of the Buffalo National River Corridor and the adjacent Ozark National Forest. I will not be more specific than this, because the people who know the area well are protective of it, and because the specificity of the location matters less than the character of what is there. What is there is a landscape that shows signs of having been organized. Not the dramatic, unmistakable organization of a temple complex or a planned town, but a subtler organization, the kind that emerges when a community inhabits a landscape over a long period and gradually builds up a system of marked places, pathways between them, and a set of practices that relate the human community to the non-human world around it. There are pathways, not roads, not cleared tracks, but routes through the landscape that are marked by a consistency of cairns and wall segments at regular intervals, and that connect locations that seem significant for various reasons, high points with broad views, springs, caves, glades where the exposure to the sky is unobstructed. The pathways are not always obvious. You have to know to look for them, have to have enough experience of the landscape to recognize what regularity of stone placement means in context. But once you know to look, they are there. There is a researcher who has walked these pathways many times, over many years, who describes the experience as being guided, not in any supernatural sense, but in the practical sense that the arrangement of features makes the route intuitive, that when you come to a high point and look ahead, there is almost always another feature visible in the direction you would naturally walk if you were trying to maintain elevation and visibility. The pathway is a kind of argument, a spatial argument that says, walk here, go to that next place, and from that next place you will be able to see the place after it. Whether this system of pathways and markers was designed as a navigational aid, or as a ceremonial procession route, or as something else entirely, she cannot say with confidence. But she is confident that it was designed, that the spatial logic of it is too consistent to be accidental, and that it represents a significant human achievement, the organization of a landscape into a coherent system that would have been readable and useful and meaningful to the people who built it and to those who came after. Here is something I find myself thinking about often when I spend time with this material. The category of the unexplained, in American popular culture, tends to be associated with a certain kind of excitement, a kind of frisson of the forbidden and the mysterious that attaches itself to things like UFOs and Bigfoot and ancient astronauts and other phenomena that are culturally coded as outside the mainstream. This excitement is understandable. It is human. The desire to find something that the established order cannot account for, something that calls into question the neat certainties of the official story, is a deep and genuine desire, but it often gets in the way. When the Ozarks stone structures are framed as mysterious in the sensational sense, as belonging to the genre of alternative archaeology with its lost civilizations and secret histories and suppressed truths, they get pulled into a discourse that is largely unhelpful. The sensational framing attracts attention, but it attracts the wrong kind of attention, the kind that does not lead to careful investigation but to circular argumentation and confirmation bias, and the kind of motivated reasoning that sees what it wants to see rather than what is actually there. The Ozark stone structures are genuinely puzzling. They deserve to be taken seriously. Taking them seriously means subjecting them to the most rigorous investigation available, not protecting them from scrutiny, but welcoming it, because rigorous investigation is the only path to understanding. If the investigation reveals that the structures are exactly what the conventional interpretation says they are, then the conventional interpretation is strengthened and we have learned something. If it reveals that they are something more and older and stranger, then we have learned something even more important. What does not serve anyone is the alternative, leaving them in the zone of acknowledged but unstudied, where they can be neither confirmed nor refuted, where they continue to generate speculation without generating knowledge. The mystery worth attending to is not the sensational mystery of forbidden history. It is the quieter and more profound mystery of what it means to encounter evidence of a human past that has not been adequately understood. Evidence that sits in the landscape of a region that most Americans think they know, waiting for the right questions. Let me close with a story. In the hills of Shannon County, Missouri, in country that is now part of the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, there is a ridge that the locals have called White Rocks Ridge for as long as anyone can remember. The name comes from the light-colored dolomite that outcrops at the ridge's summit, exposed by erosion of the thin soil above it, gleaming pale in certain lights. On the summit of White Rocks Ridge, there is a stone structure. It has been there for as long as anyone in the area can remember, which means it was there before the Forest Service began managing the land, before the Civilian Conservation Corps built trails and campgrounds in the area in the 1930s, before the settlers who came to this part of Missouri in the 1850s and 60s. The structure is a wall. It is about 4 feet high in its best preserved sections and about 60 feet long in total, running along the south-facing edge of the summit in an arc that opens toward the north. The wall is built of dolomite blocks, some of them quite large, carefully selected for their flatness and laid in 3 or 4 courses with a consistency that reflects real masonry skill. At the eastern end of the wall, there is a gap, an intentional opening, perhaps 4 feet wide, flanked on each side by larger upright stones that have been set into the ground rather than simply placed on top of the wall. The opening faces almost exactly east-northeast, which is the direction of the winter solstice sunrise from this latitude. I have been to White Rocks Ridge. I have sat in the gap of that wall on a morning in late December, with the sun coming up over the distant ridge to the east-northeast, with the cold air of a Missouri winter morning sharp in my lungs, and I have felt the light come through that opening and fall on my face. It was intentional. I am as certain of this as I can be certain of anything that I cannot prove. The opening was placed to receive that light, to frame that specific moment of the year, to create a space where a human being could sit and be met by the winter sunrise in a way that was not accidental. I do not know who made it. I do not know when. I do not know why it mattered to them to mark that moment in stone, to create something that would still be receiving the winter solstice sunrise after they were gone, after everything that connected them to this place had dissolved back into the hillside. But it mattered. The mattering is the last thing that remains, beyond the stones themselves. It is there in the care of the construction, in the precision of the orientation, in the choice of stone, and the selection of this ridge, and the act of building something that was meant to last. It lasted. The coals are nearly out now. The stars have moved in their slow arc across the sky, as they have been moving every night for the whole of human time. The hollows below are full of the sound of water and the sound of wind in the upper branches of the hardwoods. And somewhere in the distance, an owl has been calling, steady and unhurried, for the past hour. The stones are there. On White Rocks Ridge and above the current river, and on the bluff tops above the 11 Point, and in the Writing Cave, and at the tributary mouths, and at the high points, and at the springs, and in all the places that I have talked about tonight and all the places I have not had time to mention, the stones are there, and they will be there when morning comes, and they will be there when morning comes again, many thousands of mornings from now, if we are careful, if we pay attention, if we do the work that needs to be done to understand them before more of them are lost. That is all I have to say tonight. The rest is silence, and the silence is where the stones have always lived, and the silence is, in its own way, an answer. Sleep now. The night is deep and the hills are old, and the light that left those winter stars before anyone alive today was born is still, right now, arriving. Rest well under it. The Ozarks keep their secrets, but they keep them in stone, and stone, as I have said, is patient. Good night. But the night is still long, and there is more to hold before sleep comes fully, so let me take you deeper still into what the hills contain and what the hills have not yet given up. Because the stone structures, for all their mystery, are not the only things that sit outside the established story of the Ozarks. There is a broader pattern, a pattern that encompasses the stones but extends beyond them into other categories of evidence that together suggests something more extensive than any single type of feature could suggest alone. Let me tell you about the gardens. Not gardens in the ornamental sense, not flower beds or kitchen plots, but what archaeologists call garden beds or raised field complexes, agricultural or horticultural modifications of the landscape that are large enough to be visible as landscape features even after centuries of abandonment. These features have been documented in the Great Lakes region, in the upper Midwest, in parts of New England, in the coastal Southeast. They are recognized as evidence of sophisticated pre-Columbian land management, of a relationship between human communities and the productive landscape around them that involved deliberate and sustained modification of the terrain. In the Ozarks, there are places where the topography has been modified in ways that do not fit the pattern of European-American agricultural improvement. These modifications are subtle: slight terracing on hillsides, what appear to be berm and swale systems in bottomland areas, the occasional presence of soil profile anomalies in agricultural fields that suggest prior landscape modification. None of this is dramatic. None of it is the kind of obvious earthwork that immediately reads as pre-Columbian, but it is persistent, and it occurs in association with the stone features in ways that suggest the modifications and the structures may be part of the same cultural landscape. The most careful documentation of these possible garden features in the Ozarks was done by a woman named Patricia Red Cloud, who was an agricultural extension agent in northern Arkansas for 23 years before her retirement, and who brought to her investigation of these features the same practical knowledge of soil and terrain that she had applied throughout her career to helping farmers understand their land. She was not an archaeologist and made no claim to be one. She was a woman who knew what modified land looked like and who had begun to notice, over years of driving the back roads of Carroll and Boone counties in Arkansas, that certain areas of terrain had a character that she could not explain by reference to the practices of European-American settlers. She documented what she found with the same systematic attention she brought to everything: photographs, soil descriptions, topographic sketches, notes on the vegetation growing on the anomalous features as compared to the surrounding terrain. She compiled her documentation into a report and submitted it to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey in 2004. She received an acknowledgement. Patricia Red Cloud is in her 80s now and lives in a small town in Carroll County. She still has her documentation. She is still waiting. There is a question that I have been circling around for most of this evening, a question that I want to try to address directly, because I think it is the most important question raised by the evidence I have been presenting. The question is this: if there was a sophisticated pre-Columbian culture in the Ozarks, one capable of the kinds of organized landscape modification and construction that the stone structures suggest, what were they doing? What was the purpose of the system, the overall design of the cultural landscape that the structures and the pathways and the possible garden features together represent? I cannot answer this question with confidence, but I can offer a hypothesis, drawn from what we know about comparable cultural landscapes in other parts of the world, that I think is worth entertaining. The hypothesis is that the Ozark cultural landscape, if that is what the evidence represents, was organized around a set of practices centered on the relationship between human communities and the non-human forces that governed their world. The movements of the sun and moon, the behavior of water both above and below ground, the seasonal cycles of the plants and animals on which they depended. The stone structures marked the key nodes of this relationship, the places where the sky and the earth and the underground world most powerfully intersected, the places where attention and ceremony and the organized intentionality of stone construction were most appropriate. This is not a claim that they had a religion in the institutional sense, a set of doctrines and priesthoods and prescribed rituals. It is a claim that they had, as all long-established human communities have, a sophisticated and nuanced understanding of their relationship with the world around them, and that they expressed that understanding in the built environment, in the modification of the landscape to make it more legible to the generations that would come after them. The stone structures are, in this reading, a kind of annotation system, a way of writing in the landscape the most important truths about how it works and what it requires and what it offers to those who attend to it properly. The annotations are not arbitrary. They encode real knowledge, the positions of the sun at significant moments, the locations of reliable water, the pathways through the terrain that are most efficient and most significant, the places where the underground world meets the surface world in ways that have proved, over many generations of observation, to be meaningful. The relationship between the Ozarks and water deserves more attention than I have given it, because water is so central to the character of the plateau that any serious consideration of the cultural landscape must take it into account. The Ozarks are a hydrological anomaly. In a landscape where rainfall is moderate, a region that is neither especially wet nor especially dry by the standards of the temperate interior of North America, the presence of such an extraordinary abundance of flowing surface water is explained by the geology. The karst aquifer beneath the plateau acts as a giant storage reservoir, collecting precipitation and releasing it through thousands of springs at a relatively constant rate, regardless of seasonal fluctuation. For a community living in the Ozarks before the era of drilled wells and municipal water supplies, this hydrological pattern meant something specific. There was always water, and it was always in specific places, and those places were not evenly distributed across the landscape. The springs were the anchors of the human geography. They were the places you always came back to, the places you oriented your movements around, the places that were, in the most literal and practical sense, essential to life. And the springs, as I mentioned earlier, are systematically associated with stone structures. The association is not universal, but it is consistent enough, across enough sites, to be a pattern rather than a coincidence. The interpretation of this pattern as reflecting spring veneration, the understanding of springs as sacred places where the underground world and the surface world communicate, is an interpretation that many indigenous American traditions would support. Springs in many Native American cosmologies are understood as entrances to the world beneath the ground, as places where the power and knowledge of the earth world is accessible to those who approach with proper attention and intention. This is not superstition. It is a way of encoding, in cosmological language, the practical reality that springs are irreplaceable, that the community's survival depends on their constancy, that the relationship with the spring is a relationship that must be maintained. Building stone structures at springs was, perhaps, a way of maintaining that relationship, a physical expression of the recognition that the spring was not just a resource to be exploited, but a place that deserved acknowledgement and care, a monument to the importance of water in a landscape where water, despite its apparent abundance, was not to be taken for granted. There is an interesting parallel with what has been documented in the British Isles, where a tradition of spring veneration that predated Christianity and was only partially absorbed by it, leaving traces in the practice of wishing wells and in the formal blessing of springs and wells by the medieval church. Some researchers have argued that the British tradition of spring veneration, which is associated in some cases with the construction of stone structures at or near springs, represents a continuity from the Neolithic period, from the same deep cultural roots that produced the great megalithic monuments. I am not suggesting that the Ozarks stone structures are related to the British megalithic tradition in any direct cultural historical sense. The two traditions are separated by an ocean and many thousands of years, and almost certainly have no connection to each other beyond the very general connection that all human beings share in responding to the same fundamental features of the world, the movements of the sky, the presence of water, the need to mark what matters. But the parallel is suggestive in a different way. It suggests that the practices I have been describing in the Ozarks, spring veneration, astronomical orientation of constructed features, the marking of significant landscape nodes with durable stone structures, are not exotic or unusual in the global context of pre-industrial human culture. They are, in fact, extremely common. They are what human communities do, everywhere in the world, when they have been in a landscape long enough to understand it deeply. The Ozarks were inhabited for at least 14,000 years before European contact. 14,000 years is a very long time, long enough to develop a very deep understanding of the landscape, long enough for the marking of what matters to accumulate into a complex and integrated system. The question is not whether the stone structures make sense in this context. They make perfect sense. The question is why we have been so reluctant to see them for what they are. Let me try to answer that question one more time, from a different angle. Part of the answer, as I have said, is institutional. The research infrastructure for understanding pre-Columbian North America was built in a particular era and organized around particular questions and it has not been fully updated to accommodate the evidence that has accumulated in the past several decades. But part of the answer is also cultural, and the cultural part is harder to fix than the institutional part. Americans tend to think of themselves as a people without a deep past. The historical consciousness of the United States is organized around the European settlement of the continent, around the 3 or 4 centuries between Jamestown and the present, around a founding story that begins with Europeans and treats whatever came before as prologue at best, an obstacle at worst. This temporal shallowness is not accidental. It is built into the national mythology, and it serves specific functions, most of them having to do with the legitimation of settlement and the suppression of the claims that derive from prior occupation. The stone structures of the Ozarks and the broader evidence of pre-Columbian complexity in the interior of North America challenge this temporal shallowness. They assert the reality of a deep past, of human achievement and human presence over a timescale that makes the European-American occupation of the continent look like a brief intrusion. They suggest that the landscape we think of as ours, the American landscape, the heartland, was organized and known and cared for by other people for a very long time before we arrived. This is not a comfortable assertion. It is not politically convenient. It is not the kind of history that fits easily into the national mythology. And so, in the way that uncomfortable things get handled in institutional contexts, it gets explained away, or filed away, or simply not looked at. The silence around the Ozark stone structures is, among other things, a symptom of this larger cultural reluctance to sit with the complexity of the American past. I want to tell you one final story about an individual and their relationship with these hills, because I think the individual human dimension of this is as important as the institutional dimension, and because it is easy, in a narrative organized around institutions and research programs and structural biases, to lose sight of the fact that what we are ultimately talking about is people paying attention to a landscape and to the traces of other people's attention that it contains. There is a man, I will call him Thomas because he does not want his real name used, who grew up in the hills of Douglas County, Missouri, the son of a family that had farmed the same hollow for 4 generations. He is in his 60s now, and he still lives in that hollow, in the same house where he was born, farming a portion of the land and working a part-time job in the nearest town. Thomas has been walking the hills around his hollow since he was a child. He knows them better than he knows anything, better than he knows any person or any text or any other piece of the world. He knows where the springs are and where the reliable deer crossings are, and where the best black walnuts grow, and where the blueberries ripen first in early summer. He knows the hollow in all its weathers and all its seasons, across a lifetime. He also knows where the stones are. He found the first one when he was 11 years old, scrambling up a ridge above the hollow on a day when he had nothing in particular to do, and was just moving through the landscape the way kids move through landscapes they are entirely comfortable in, without destination or purpose. He came to a clearing on the ridge, a natural glade where the cedar gave way to grass and bare rock, and in the middle of the clearing he found a circle of stones. It was, he says, the strangest feeling he has ever had. Not frightening, not supernatural, just the clear, unmistakable sense that someone had been here and had done something deliberate with these stones, and that the doing of it had mattered to them in some way that he could not articulate but could feel. He went back. Over the following years he went back many times, and he found more. He found walls and cairns, and what appeared to be a cleared and levelled surface near a spring on the north side of the ridge. He found, on a bluff face below the cleared surface, marks that he recognized as made by human hands, though he did not know what they meant. He told his father said that the old people always knew about those stones, had always called that ridge the old place, and that you went up there respectfully, and you did not disturb what was there, and that was all he had to say about it. Thomas has not disturbed what is there. He has not brought researchers up to look at it, though he has been approached by people who heard vague accounts of what his ridge contains. He is protective of it in a way that is not possessive, but that is, I think, a form of care, the same form of care that his father's phrase always knew about those stones implies, a multi-generational acknowledgement of significance that does not require explanation. When I asked him what he thought the stones were, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I have been thinking about ever since. He said, "I think they were how people said they were paying attention." Paying attention. I keep coming back to that phrase, which I used earlier in this conversation in a different context, and which Thomas arrived at independently, in his own words, from his own experience of this landscape and these stones. It is, I think, a phrase that captures something essential about what the stone structures of the Ozarks represent, something that the vocabulary of archaeology, with its cultural periods and typological sequences and functional attributions, does not quite capture. Paying attention. Not observation in the scientific sense, not the detached recording of data by an observer who stands outside the system being observed. Something more engaged than that. Something that involves the full presence of the person in the landscape, the bringing of all available perception to bear on the task of understanding where you are and what it is asking of you. The people who built the stone structures were paying attention. They were paying attention to the sky and to the water and to the terrain and to the seasonal cycles of the plants and animals around them. They were paying attention in a sustained and organized way over many lifetimes, building up a cumulative understanding of the landscape that was then encoded in stone so that the encoding itself would outlast the individual lives of those who held the knowledge. And in doing so, they were asking something of the people who would come after them. They were asking to be paid attention to. They were placing their marks in the landscape and leaving them there, with the patience of stone, trusting that eventually someone would stand in front of one of those marks and recognize it for what it was and ask the right questions. Thomas asked the right questions, even if he did not have the institutional framework to pursue the answers. Mary Jones asked the right questions, and she keeps going up to that ridge and paying attention. The amateur researchers I have been describing throughout this evening asked the right questions, and they documented what they found as best they could and tried to share it with people who might be able to do something with it. The right questions are not always the questions that produce immediate answers. Sometimes the right question is simply the one that refuses to be satisfied with the explanation that explains the evidence away, that keeps insisting, quietly and persistently, that the evidence deserves more careful attention than it has received. The Ozarks are still full of questions. In the karst country of southern Missouri, where the rivers disappear into the ground and emerge a mile away as full-size springs, there are patterns in the distribution of those springs that no one has yet mapped in relation to the stone structures. The springs follow the fracture lines in the bedrock, and the fracture lines follow the ancient structural geometry of the plateau, and the structural geometry of the plateau is, in a sense, the deep grammar of this landscape, the underlying order around which everything else is organized. Did the people who built the stone structures understand the structural geometry of the plateau? Did they map it in their own way, encode it in their system of marked places and sightlines and pathway networks? It is a question that cannot be answered without the kind of comprehensive survey that has not yet been done, but it is a question worth asking. In the caves beneath the plateau, in the long, dark passages that connect springs and sinkholes and underground streams into a hydrological system of extraordinary complexity, there are passages that have never been fully explored, chambers that have never been entered, features that no human eye has seen since whatever time it was when human beings last visited them. What is in those unexplored chambers? What marks, what structures, what evidence of the underground dimension of the cultural landscape that the surface structures hint at? We do not know. We may not know for a long time. The exploration of cave archaeology in the Ozarks has barely begun, and what has been found suggests that there is much more to find. In the river gravels of the major Ozarks waterways, in the chert-rich deposits of the White River and the Current River and the 11 Point, there are projectile points and scrapers and other worked stone objects that represent a sequence of human tool use extending back many thousands of years. This sequence has been partially studied, but the early portions of it, the Paleo-Indian and early Archaic periods, are poorly understood in the Ozarks context. The oldest people who lived in these hills left the faintest traces, and those traces are the hardest to find and the hardest to interpret. Were those earliest Ozarkers, the people who came to the plateau when the ice sheets were still melting to the north and the landscape was still reorganizing itself into the ecological communities we know today, were they the first to mark the high places and the springs with stone? Or is the stone marking tradition younger, a product of the cultural development of the Middle and Late Archaic periods when populations increased and settlement patterns became more structured? We do not know. The questions extend backward in time in ways that the current evidence cannot resolve. I want to say something about silence that I have not quite said yet. The silence around the Ozark stone structures, the institutional silence and the cultural silence, and the silence of the geological time that has surrounded these features since they were built, is also a kind of presence. It is not the absence of something, it is the presence of something that has not yet been named. When you stand at one of these sites, and it is quiet around you, when the wind is not blowing and the birds have stopped calling and the only sound is the deep ambient hum of the living landscape, there is a quality to the silence that is different from ordinary silence. It has a texture. It has a weight. It has the quality of attention, as if the place itself is attending to you as carefully as you are attending to it. This is not mysticism. It is, I think, a perfectly natural response to being in a place that has been attended to, carefully and repeatedly, over a very long time. Human attention leaves traces, not only in the physical modifications it produces, but in the way a place comes to feel when you are in it. The places that have been attended to feel different from the places that have not. The stone structures of the Ozarks feel attended to. They feel like places that were chosen and visited and cared for over many generations, that absorb the attention of many people across a long span of time, and that carry some residue of that attention in the way they sit in the landscape. This is a subjective response, and I acknowledge that it is not scientific evidence for anything. But it is consistent. It recurs across the accounts of many people who have spent time at these sites, and it says something, at minimum, about the quality of the places that were chosen as sites for construction. The people who built these structures chose places that already had a particular quality, and the quality they chose for is something that can still be felt. It is very late now. The night has gone past the middle point, and is heading toward the false dawn, that grey lightening of the sky that precedes the true sunrise by an hour or so, that hints at the day without yet delivering it. In a few hours, the sun will rise over the Ozarks. It will come up at the azimuth appropriate to the current season, following the path it has followed since before there were human beings to watch it. It will catch the tops of the bluffs and the exposed rock of the ridges before it reaches the hollows, and the shadows of the cedar trees will lie long and precise across the glades. And on some of those ridges, on some of those bluff tops, the morning light will fall on stones that were placed to receive it, that were oriented to frame it, that were built to stand in its path and be illuminated by it at specific moments in the year. The stones will be lit. They will not know they are lit. They are stones. But they will be exactly where they were placed, doing exactly what they were placed to do, receiving the light of the same sun that the people who placed them watched rising over these same hills. That continuity, across the gap of however many centuries, seems to me like something worth dwelling on in the last minutes before sleep. The stones are still doing their work. Whatever their work was, they are doing it. The sun is still rising at the winter solstice in the azimuth that frames the opening of that wall on White Rock's ridge. The light at the winter solstice still enters the east-facing cave at the base of the bluff. The line of cairns along the 11-point tributary is still there, still marking the route from the river to whatever was at the head of that hollow. The work persists. And we are here, at the other end of the long bridge that those stone structures span, receiving the message they contain, which is, someone was here, and this mattered, and they built something to last because they believed that what they understood was worth preserving. It was worth preserving. It is still worth preserving. The work of understanding, it is not finished. It has barely begun. But it is being done, slowly and imperfectly and without adequate resources, by people who have the same quality of attention that the original builders had, the willingness to sit with a landscape and pay attention to it and follow what the attention reveals. And that work, when it eventually arrives at something like understanding, will be one of the best things that has happened in American archaeology. It will change the story we tell about who was here and what they achieved and what this landscape meant to the people who knew it for thousands of years, before anyone thought to call it the Ozarks. The embers have gone grey, the owl is quiet. The water in the hollow below is the only sound left, and it is a sound that the hills have always made, a sound that the people who placed these stones heard every night of their lives, a sound that means everything is as it should be, that the world is proceeding in its patient way, that the night is nearly over and the morning is nearly here. The stones are there. The questions are there. The morning will come, as it always does, at the azimuth appropriate to the season, illuminating the features of this landscape with the same light that illuminated them when they were made. We are the inheritors of this landscape and of the long human history it contains. We have not yet done our full duty by that inheritance, but the night is long and the stones are patient, and there is still time. Sleep now. Let the questions settle into the deep place where good questions go when they are not yet answered, where they wait and where they are not lost but only resting, the way the world rests in the hours before dawn. The Ozarks will be here when you wake, the stones will be there, and somewhere on a ridge in Shannon County, in the first light of the morning, a winter solstice sunrise will be doing what it has done for as long as there has been a winter solstice, illuminating an opening in a low dolomite wall on a cedar-topped ridge, falling through the gap in exactly the way that someone, a long time ago, intended it to fall. Good night. The mystery endures. The stones stand. The light arrives. Sleep well. But there is one more thread I want to pull on before we let the night have its way with us completely, because the story of the Ozarks stone structures does not end at the Ozarks boundary, and understanding where it connects to the larger fabric of American prehistory is part of understanding why it matters. The upland interior of eastern North America, the whole arc of it from the Ouachitas in the west to the Appalachians in the east, with the Cumberland Plateau and the Ozarks and the Shawnee Hills of southern Illinois filling in between, has been the forgotten quadrant of pre-Columbian archaeology for a very long time. The attention went to the coasts and to the great river valleys and to the southwest and to the Ohio Valley. The uplands in between were treated as margins, as the periphery of the systems that were centered elsewhere. But the uplands share a set of ecological characteristics that made them, for people with the right knowledge and the right adaptations, extraordinarily productive places to live. They have diverse and reliable food resources. They have abundant and reliable water. They have the kind of topographic complexity that allows a skilled and knowledgeable people to find shelter and advantage across all seasons. And they have one more thing that deserves more attention than it has received. They have stone. Good stone. Usable stone. Stone in the quantities and qualities that allow the kinds of construction I have been describing. The Ozarks have it. The Ouachitas have it. The Cumberland Plateau has it. The Appalachians have it. And in all of these places, when researchers look carefully, there are stone structures. Structures that share enough characteristics to suggest the possibility, however tentatively it must be held, that they are part of a related tradition, a broad cultural pattern of upland stone marking that extends across the entire interior of the eastern continent. This is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. It would require an enormous amount of comparative work to evaluate seriously. But it is the kind of hypothesis that becomes available once you take the individual pieces of evidence seriously enough to look for the connections between them. The Ozarks are not an isolated puzzle. They may be one piece of a much larger picture. And the picture, if it can be assembled, would change fundamentally how we understand the pre-Columbian human geography of the eastern half of North America. There is something called the Poverty Point culture, centered in what is now northeastern Louisiana, that dates to roughly 3,500 years before present, and that represents one of the most extraordinary achievements of the Archaic period in North America. Poverty Point is a complex of earthen ridges and mounds built in a geometric arrangement on a bluff above the Mississippi floodplain, a structure of such scale and precision that when it was first formally described in the 1950s, archaeologists could barely believe it was pre-Columbian. It is pre-Columbian. It is archaic, which means it was built by hunter-gatherers, not by agricultural societies. The people who built it had no grain stores, no domesticated animals, no settled villages in the usual sense. They were mobile foragers who aggregated at this site for purposes that remain only partly understood, who organized themselves to build something that required an extraordinary investment of coordinated labor, and who traded for exotic materials, including stone from sources hundreds of miles away, including sources in the Ozarks. The Ozarks, specifically the chert formations of the Springfield Plateau in Missouri and Arkansas, were a source of raw material for stone tools that entered the trade networks of the Archaic period. We know this because Ozarks chert has been identified at sites far from the Ozarks, sites where it had to have arrived through exchange. People in Louisiana, in Tennessee, in the Ohio Valley, in the Great Lakes region had Ozarks chert. They valued it enough to move it enormous distances. This means that the Ozarks were not isolated. They were connected. The people who lived in the Ozarks 3,000 years ago were part of a continent-wide network of exchange and interaction. They knew people, through the intermediaries of that network, who knew people in places very far away. Information traveled with the chert. Ideas traveled with the information. Did the idea of marking significant landscape features with stone travel through those same networks? Did the tradition of celestial orientation of constructed features flow along the same pathways as the exotic stone? These are questions that cannot be answered with the evidence, but they point toward a kind of investigation that has not yet been done, a systematic comparison of the stone marking traditions of the upland interior with the earthwork building traditions of the lowland centers, looking for the structural similarities and the differences that would help establish whether these traditions are related and how. The church connection runs in multiple directions, and one of them leads somewhere unexpected. Among the materials that have been found at Ozark sites, in addition to the local church, there are occasional pieces of stone that came from very far away. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Lake Superior region, shell from the Gulf Coast. The presence of these materials establishes, beyond any serious doubt, that the Ozarks were integrated into the long-distance exchange networks of pre-Columbian North America, that the people here were not isolated provincials, but participants in a continental conversation. This matters for understanding the stone structures because it changes the baseline assumption. If the people of the Ozarks were in contact with the builders of the great earthwork complexes of the Ohio Valley, if they knew about the cosmological and ceremonial traditions that animated those construction projects, if they had access to the ideas and the knowledge systems that organized the Hopewellian cultural world, then the question of whether they would build their own versions of marked landscape, organized around similar principles of celestial orientation and landscape integration, becomes less surprising and more natural. The Ozarks were not outside the Hopewellian world, they were on its edge. And things on the edge of cultural systems often develop their own distinctive expressions of the ideas that animate those systems. The edge is where the center's ideas are adapted to local conditions, where the universals of the cosmological tradition encounter the particularities of a specific landscape and a specific community, and where the synthesis that results is something new and something local. The stone structures of the Ozarks may be that synthesis. Not a pale copy of the Hopewellian earthwork tradition, but a local expression of ideas that were shared across a much wider region. Ideas about the relationship between human communities and the non-human world, between the built environment and the movements of the sky, between the places that matter and the ways of marking them in durable form. I want to close this long evening by returning to the most fundamental question, the one that underlies everything else, the one that gives this investigation its meaning beyond the academic. Why does it matter? Not in the sense of why it matters to archaeologists or to the academic study of pre-Columbian North America, though it matters to those things. In the larger sense, why should you, lying in the dark listening to this, care about stone structures on ridges in Missouri and Arkansas that most people have never heard of and will never see? I think it matters for the same reason that all deep history matters, which is that it changes the scale of the story we are in. When you know that the Ozarks have been inhabited for 14,000 years, that the landscape you drive through on your way to float the current river or fish the 11 Point was once organized and known and cared for by people with a sophisticated understanding of it that we have not yet recovered, you are in a different kind of country. You are in a country that has a depth to it that the standard story does not capture, that has been home to human intention and human achievement far longer and in far more varied forms than the textbooks suggest. And that depth is not a curiosity or an academic interest. It is a challenge and a responsibility. The question it asks is, given that this landscape has a deep history, given that it carries within it the traces of a very long human relationship with the non-human world, what are we going to do about that? Are we going to continue to ignore it, to let the development and the bulldozers and the indifference of institutional research continue to diminish what remains? Or are we going to find a way to take it seriously, to investigate it honestly, to incorporate it into our understanding of what this country is and what it carries? I do not have a policy prescription. I am not in a position to tell you what exactly should be done. But I think the first step is the simplest and the hardest, to acknowledge that what is there is real, to sit with the evidence, not explaining it away and not inflating it beyond what it demonstrates, but looking at it honestly and saying, this is real, this happened, someone was here and they built these things, and they deserve more careful attention than they have received. That acknowledgement is a kind of paying attention. It is what the stones are asking for. And it is, I think, a worthy way to honor the people who placed them, those patient, careful, long ago people who looked at this landscape and understood it in ways we are only beginning to recover. The grey before dawn is coming now, somewhere east of wherever you are. The hills are still dark, but they are a different dark than the deep dark of midnight. They are a dark with direction to it, a dark that knows morning is coming, that has already begun to orient itself toward the light. Somewhere on a ridge in the Ozarks, the first bird has already started its call. It will call, and the call will move across the hollow and up the other ridge and on across the plateau, bird by bird, in the ancient relay that precedes every dawn in every landscape where birds live. The stones are still there. They will be there when the light comes. They will receive the light, as they always do, at the azimuths that matter, the ones that mark the significant moments of the year's turning. Some of them will catch the first light of the winter morning and hold it in the way that pale dolomite holds light, with a kind of brightness that seems to come from within the stone rather than from outside it. Some of them will be in shadow until the sun is higher, and then the shadow will move across them in the way that time itself moves, steadily and in one direction. The people who place those stones are gone, but the placing remains, the intention remains, encoded in the orientation of the stones, in the relationships between the features, in the spatial grammar of the landscape they modified. And we are here, at this end of the bridge they built, still capable of crossing it if we choose to pay enough attention. I hope you sleep well. I hope the questions this evening has raised settle into you gently, the way stone settles into a hillside over a long time, becoming part of the landscape, part of the way you see things. The Ozarks will be there when you wake. The stones will be there. The morning will come at whatever azimuth the season requires. Rest now. You are, whether you think of yourself this way or not, the inheritor of a 14,000-year human story in this landscape. The people at the beginning of that story place stones with intention and care. You have spent this evening with their work. Let it mean what it means. Let the mystery be a mystery. Sleep well. Good night. There are things that happen in the Ozarks that most people do not see because they are not looking for them, and I want to spend these last remaining minutes before sleep describing a few of them, not because they are the most dramatic or the most conclusive pieces of evidence in this long story, but because they are the kind of evidence that accumulates in the margins of the established record, in the notes of travelers and the accounts of landowners and the photographs taken by people who happen to be in the right place with the right kind of attention. In the spring, when the pawpaws flower, their dark burgundy blossoms are visible at a distance as a reddish haze in the bottomland woods, and the people who know the Ozarks have always used the pawpaw flowering as a seasonal marker, a signal that a particular moment in the year's turning has arrived. The pawpaws tend to flower at roughly the same time as certain other phenological events in the behavior of animals and the emergence of particular plants, and together these events constitute a kind of natural calendar, a set of reliable seasonal signals that can be used by anyone who pays close enough attention over enough years. The people who built the stone structures paid this kind of attention. We can infer this because the structures, with their solar and possibly lunar alignments, represent exactly the kind of sustained phenological observation that is required to understand the landscape at the level of detail that makes the marking of specific astronomical moments meaningful. You do not align a stone structure to the winter solstice sunrise unless you have watched the winter solstice sunrise enough times, from enough places, to know exactly where it occurs and exactly what it looks like and exactly what it means in the context of the seasonal cycle. The alignment of the structure is the end product of a very long process of observation. The observation and the structure together constitute a complete act of knowing, an act that says, we have paid attention to this for long enough to understand it, and we are encoding what we understand in stone, so that those who come after us will have a starting point for their own attention. This is a form of education, not the kind of education that happens in classrooms or through texts, but the kind that happens through deliberate modification of the environment in ways that teach. The built landscape is a teacher. The stone structures of the Ozarks were, among other things, a teaching device, a way of passing the knowledge of the landscape to the generations who had not yet lived long enough to acquire it through direct experience. When a young person growing up in the community that built these structures went to the high ridge with its aligned wall for the first time on the morning of the winter solstice and saw the sunrise come through the gap, that was an education in what the winter solstice means, in where it falls in the year, in what it signals about the weeks ahead. The structure taught through experience. It made abstract astronomical knowledge concrete and immediate, and felt. We learn in a very different way now. We learn from texts and screens, but the underlying cognitive act, the creation of a shared reference that allows a community to orient itself in time and space, is the same. We are still doing what those Ozarks builders did. We are still making marks in the world that serve as shared reference points, shared orientations, shared acknowledgements of what matters. The stone structures are their marks. These words are mine. And in both cases, what is being transmitted is an insistence that the world is worth attending to, that the attention is worth preserving, and that those who come after us deserve to inherit not just the facts of what we knew, but the act of knowing itself, the practice of paying close and careful and sustained attention to the world we are in. The light that is coming now, the grey pre-dawn that is reaching toward the Ozarks from whatever direction morning comes from where you are, is the same light that reached those ridgetops every morning for the entire time that anyone was alive to see it. It is not a special light. It is not a sacred light in any formal sense. It is simply light, doing what light does, revealing what was hidden by the dark. What it reveals, this morning, as every morning, is a landscape. A landscape of rounded hills and deep hollows and clear rivers and cedar glades and bluff faces and springs. A landscape that has been inhabited by human beings for 14,000 years and that carries within it, in the stone features on its high places, and in the marks on its cave walls, and in the spatial organization of its significant locations, the traces of all that time of habitation, all that time of attention. You will not see the stone structures from the road. Most of them are not visible from the road. They are up on the ridges, in the cedar and the oak, accessible only to those who are willing to walk the terrain on the terrain's own terms, to go where there are no marked trails, to find their way by attention to the landscape, rather than by following someone else's signs. But they are there. And if you were to go there, and if you were to find one of them, and if you were to stand at it in the early morning light of the appropriate season, you would understand something that I have been trying to convey through all these words, something that does not quite reduce to words. You would understand that someone stood here, and that standing here mattered, and that the mattering was real enough to move them to build something that would still be standing when the world had changed beyond anything they could have imagined. And you would understand that you are in some way continuous with that person, that the same impulse that moved them to mark this place is alive in you, that the attention you are paying to the landscape right now, even the mediated, second-hand attention of listening to someone describe it in the dark, is a version of the same fundamental act, paying attention. It is, in the end, what we do. It is what makes us human in the most essential sense. We attend to the world, we notice things, we ask what they mean, we make marks, in stone or in words or in code or in whatever medium is available to us, that say to those who come after us, I was here and this mattered and I wanted you to know. The stones of the Ozarks say exactly this. And now, at the end of this long night, so do I. The morning is coming, the light is coming. The stones are there, and they are lit, and they will be lit again tomorrow, and they will be lit again long after everyone alive today has returned to the same earth from which they were raised. This is enough. Sleep now, rest well, good night. And if you find, in the morning, that you remember nothing specific of what was said tonight, that the names and the places, and the researchers, and the structures have dissolved into the general softness of a night well spent in the company of old questions, that is perfectly fine. The details are not the point. The details are the vehicle for something that does not reduce to details, something that is more about posture than information, more about how you stand in relation to the world than what you know about it. The posture is this, that the world is older and stranger and more richly inhabited by human intention than the standard story suggests, and that the evidence for this is real and present and waiting for the attention it deserves, and that paying attention to it is one of the more worthwhile things a person can do with the hours between one day and the next. The Ozarks are there, the stones are there, the morning will come, sleep well. One final thought, offered very quietly in the last few seconds before sleep takes you fully. The people who placed the stones were not trying to be mysterious. They were not hiding something. They were doing what any community does when it has lived in a place long enough to understand it. They were making it legible. They were taking what they knew about the landscape and encoding it in a form that would outlast them, so that the people who came after would have a starting point, a reference, a place to begin their own paying of attention. The mystery we experience is not something they intended. It is something we created, by forgetting, by losing the thread that connected their knowledge to ours, by deciding, for reasons that had more to do with politics than with truth, that the history of this landscape began when Europeans arrived, and that whatever came before was prologue too thin and too distant to deserve careful investigation. We created the mystery by looking away. The cure for the mystery is the same as the cure for most forms of ignorance, to look carefully and honestly, and without the filters that were designed to prevent us from seeing what is actually there. The stones are patient. The morning is coming. Sleep well. The Ozarks will be there when you wake, and the questions will be there. And somewhere on a ridge in the Cedar Hills, a winter solstice sunrise will be finding its way through a gap in a dolomite wall, doing what it was designed to do, saying what it was designed to say, patient as stone, persistent as light. Good night.